Welcome back. I recently had the opportunity to sit down with UFO researcher and Dan Burish expert Brian Jackson and UFO researcher Martin Vaysse to do a deep dive that went over 2.5 hours. We talked about Project Camelot. We talked about Stephen Greer. We talked about personalities in the UFO disclosure discussion and the way that discussion gets managed. We talked about Dan Burish, the mysterious, astonishing case of Dan Burish and J-Rod. Probably one of the most interesting stories in all of ufology. And we talked about the explosive moment where George Knapp was asked about his ideas on Dan Burish, who he is, and what he's all about at Contact in the Desert. And we talk about his reaction to that question. It's a fascinating conversation. I know you're going to enjoy it. Please, if you're not already a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. It doesn't cost a dime. It only takes a second, and it really does help us out. Thank you for watching. Now enjoy the interview with Brian Jackson and Martin Vaysse.
Just so you know, I'm not sure how much this might add some additional context to our discussion since we last talked, but I did send Martin that audio of that insider reading that manifesto, whatever you want to call it. And I don't know, what did you think of that, Martin?
I thought it was extraordinary. I listened to it twice. I'm not sure if we mentioned it in our conversation last time with Clint, but previously we had spoken about the whistleblowers we found on Project Camelot. And there, Dan Burish recommended himself, but there was also Dan Sherman, who was associated with Project Preserve Destiny. And you'll notice in that file shared, Project Preserve Destiny is named. It's referenced without further reference to Dan Sherman's involvement. So I thought that was a fascinating connection.
What is Preserve Destiny?
The Project Preserve Destiny was a project that a whistleblower by the name of Dan Sherman claimed to be involved in. Dan Sherman first came forward as part of the Project Camelot release of information. This would have been about 15 years ago, I guess. And like Dan Burish, he is extraordinarily compelling, but albeit for a different set of reasons.
There's pushback whenever Project Camelot comes up, and I'm not really educated on the group too much. I understand that I think David Wilcock was involved at some point, and there's some weirdness with him. And people, whenever Project Camelot seems to come up, they're just people, a lot of people roll their eyes.
Yep.
Can we talk about Project Camelot and can explain the history of that group and what exactly happened there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware that they were, early on, they were a really proactive group between Kerry and Bill Ryan in getting some kind of, not mainstream, but extremely important, I don't want to call them whistleblowers, but people felt like they had inside information. How would you go with that, Martin?
I think that this is Ufology 1.0. This is pre-2017, when such efforts were scarce on the ground. And I think what characterized Project Camelot was their almost journalistic professionalism, in that they traveled here and traveled there, conducted long-form interviews, which they recorded on video, they presented on a website alongside with transcripts. And I think Bill Ryan and Kerry Cassidy were quite different personalities. That later became quite clear. I think Bill Ryan tended to be maybe a lot more hard-headed than Kerry Cassidy. And if I dare say it, he's seemingly less credulous. Although they did, amongst those whistleblowers, they did bring forward people whose claims bordered on the absurd. So it's very much a mixed bag of claims, and I can understand how people would have some hostility to Project Camelot.
I think the eras of ufology, I want to drill down on that, and that would be a great opportunity to explore this Camelot question, because I think for a lot of younger people, they don't really understand what the information dynamic was like pre-YouTube, pre-Google.
Yeah.
And or in those early days, and it was such a different world. We should definitely go there. Well, Martin, why don't we start with this? Can you explain to me and everyone who is watching this, what is your history with the subject and the trajectory that brought you into contact with it?
Well, my interest comes from my youth. From a teenager, I've been very interested in the subject. I grew up in Ireland, in an Ireland characterized by relative poverty and high levels of political violence. And this led me into a great interest in history, politics, economics, social science. And from that time, I could see quite clearly that humanity faced a catastrophe in the early part of the 21st century as a result of the problems stemming from overpopulation, resource exhaustion, pollution, and the conflicts that would be attendant to those conditions. Like the German philosopher Heidegger, I came to view that only a God would save us, meaning that only some extraordinary shock would ensure humanity's adaptation to the conditions it faced and allowed our survival. For me, that exogenous shock would be extraterrestrial. I've also had some personal experiences, but I think at this stage they're neither here nor there. Personally, the takeaway I took from my study of the subject that it involved and demanded the development of consciousness.
There's a lot to unpack there. The consciousness thing is huge. Obviously, all roads seem to lead there. Just going back to the jumping off point, were you looking at stuff like the Club of Rome at that time? Like what you were looking at the near-term future and these concerns about the development of humankind. At the time, what was chief among them on your mind? What were the key threats?
I think it's useful to recall maybe the intellectual atmosphere that was found in the 90s. Because we were approaching the turn of the century and the turn of the millennium, there was much discussion of the 21st century and the third millennium. It's also a time of quite pronounced technological change with the emergence of the internet, for example. And so you could find at that time there were a lot of texts, a lot of books, a lot of articles, a lot of editorials, a lot of television documentaries, all taking on sort of big picture questions. And what you could easily discern was that these questions all tended to be very closely interrelated. That the question of overpopulation led to a question of resource exhaustion and resource use, of course, then brings up the question of pollution. This is at a time, of course, when the question of pollution, for example, almost dominated the US presidential election in the year 2000. Hard to believe, but at that point you had one of the leading candidates was quite committed to taking on the issue of climate change.
So how does ufology enter the picture for you? Where does that come onto your radar, and how do you start to associate that with these threats and looking forward at what you expect to come in the
Well, in two ways.
Ensuing years?
The first way is that there was clearly a need for a change in human self-conception, how we identified with ourselves. You could see from in the 90s the danger of balkanization, not least in the form of the wars in the Balkans themselves. This was a time where you could see Yugoslavia rip itself apart. So to me, it seemed that we needed a fresh self-understanding. And with such a fresh self-understanding, then the richer countries in particular will become willing to make the sacrifices necessary in order to bring about some sort of global development. Alongside that, then, is the question of technologies. Even if you do create some sort of one world sensibility, given our current technological infrastructure, that would lead to widespread economic development in the form of ever more intensive resource use, which would precipitate an environmental collapse in time. So then there's clearly a need for novel technologies, in particular new forms of energy generation, which would be non-polluting, and of course the forms of energy generation which allow then sort of the cleansing of the environment as well. Now, what you find then in the subject of ufology, once you begin to drill into it, and particularly at that time you look at the Disclosure Project, it was probably first among equals in the field insofar as it offered an explanation as to the cover-up. You know, once you establish that the extraterrestrials are present, once you establish that governments likely know about it, well, then the great question emerges, well, why are they covering it up? And Stephen Greer, to his great credit, and Disclosure Project that he launched, it did offer very, very compelling and coherent account of why the cover-up was in place. Now, what you do find very interestingly is that that account seems to change over time, but that's another story.
We can circle back to that, but could you take another moment and tease out the time period just immediately following the collapse of the Soviet Union? That particular moment is very unique in human history. And we also had the early version of the internet, which was just starting to take off, which would later go on to change things in enormous ways. How did all of that come together in that period? You mentioned in our first conversation these eras of ufology. Can you maybe relate that back to this time period and explain what you meant by that?
When we talk about ufology, just generally, I mean, is the study of the UFO subject. And what I've noticed is that it seems to be broken into two distinct periods. One that I've called ufology 1.0 and then followed by ufology 2.0. The date separating them is December 2017. In particular, I think it's December 18th with the New York Times article speaking about ATIP. Pre-2017, what we see is ufology that's dispersed, chaotic. It's not on the internet. It's largely the product of small publishers. You'll find a vast range of views and claims and theories, but it is very much on the margins of the culture. Then in the late 90s, early part of the 21st century, you have the emergence of the Disclosure Project. What Stephen Greer did there was brought claims which were extremely credible because they were supported by first-hand witnesses. And in that vein, Project Camelot seemed to follow and overlap with what they were doing. In both instances, they're both characterized by bringing forward a wide range of first-hand witnesses who were not anonymous. In the case of the Disclosure Project, they were always non-anonymous, with some of the witnesses with Project Camelot were anonymous or pseudonymous.
And Project Camelot was that before Stephen Greer really came onto the scene, or who came first?
I think Project Camelot, I may be wrong, but I think they followed the Disclosure Project.
And so we're talking about, for people who may have been too young to remember this, a period of time where there was no internet as we understand it today. And if you wanted to learn anything about UFOs, there was like one shelf at the bookstore, and you could go there. You could go to your library and hope they had something that you were looking for, or you could go to maybe an event or something. But by and large, information wasn't available on tap at this time. And so you have a group like Camelot and then Greer doing these long form interviews with all of these different personalities, all these different people. And then through that, we start to get a clearer picture of what the inside of some of this, the machinations of this cover up might look like. But at that time, we also don't know what is true and what's not. Stephen Greer, I think, did the best job of trying to vet the people that he was putting forward. But what is your view on kind of how all that stuff rolled out? Because there's been some controversy over some of the early people that were in those interviews and that they talked to.
Well, I think it seemed to me that Stephen Greer and the Disclosure Project were much more discerning than Project Camelot. And I think as a result, Project Camelot received some maybe well-deserved criticism for promulgating the views of people who oftentimes seemed to suffer from mental health issues, to be candid. I think the virtue of long-form presentations is that the students of the subject were given good opportunity to study them and to study the claims and study how these people were presented. And what you find is that some of the witnesses proved themselves more compelling than others. And that's how, for instance, I came upon the case of Dan Burish, and it was his presentation and the quality of his presentation, his general effect is what convinced me that there was some great value to his story.
Can you talk more about that particular case, and then maybe we could get into some of the other cases that caught your attention? But that one does seem to be I'm jokingly calling it on our channel the case that won't die. It just won't go away. Every time it comes up, there are new questions. What is it that about Dan Burish, for people who aren't familiar with this man, why is his case so fascinating in your view?
His story is what you would expect. You would expect something that would be extraordinarily complex in the first case. You would expect claims that are very, very novel. You expect claims that are challenging. You would also expect to find witnesses who were extraordinarily intelligent and educated. And Burish, he seemed to be at first glance, and also that intelligence and educated was corroborated by subsequent research and the evidence that came forward. Burish was also, interestingly, seemingly to my eyes, very marked by his experience. He did seem to be quite personally changed and moved by what he had been engaged in. And I think, again, subsequent research and the evidence that came forward would corroborate that view.
In 1986, I was approached while working as an undergraduate student in Dr. Bert Bell Barbero's office, in his parasitology laboratory, to be exact. I was looking through a scope at the time. Three gentlemen walked into the laboratory, closed the door behind them. There was 2 uniforms and a suit that were present. Both of the uniforms I would make as most probably being United States Navy. My memory of that one event's kind of hazy after seeing all of the suits and uniforms and whatnot. We spoke for a while. They asked me if I was interested in seeing the world and the like. I told them I in fact was. We went through several interview processes, not unlike this, and reviewed my background. I went through several background investigations. Finally, starting up 1991 timeframe, I was cleared for working past groom to the Papoose Mountain facility, that place that doesn't exist, about 90 miles north of here, the nowhere place. That's how I came to work there. My original assignment was at the Groom Lake facility to review histopathology slides. And I went through nearly a year's testing and then was basically let loose for a year, and I heard no contact from them. After that, I was brought back in and shown some higher grade slides of unknown origin. Following that, I was introduced into a working group and subsequently brought into the Papoose facility, the Site 4 facility. We worked for well over a year on slides of unknown origin. After I took a minimum leadership position under several of the other biologists who were already present, most of which are now deceased. You know the names of those individuals. I was then introduced into the level 4-5 facility, and the 4-5 coded for 9. You're again aware, we covered this in ancient history. And so what we did is introduce the new members, myself amongst them, into the clean sphere area, and we were eventually shown the subject for which we were examining the slides.
Can we talk a little bit about some generalities around the building in which you worked, the sort of, how many floors it was, where it was located,
Sure.
how you got there?
You want an experience of Site 4, watch the Andromeda strain. Except for there's a little more color inside of Site 4. They've got a nice orange stripe on the wall, and they've got a red and blue stripe on the floor, which gives you general directions depending upon the floor you're on, and you can't move without getting stopped anyway. Now we're talking separate to the Groom facility here. I'm aware of several floors at the Groom facility, and then finally the majority of the hot stuff was taken over to Site 4. We're talking 4 basic levels. The first level, and they're coded 4-1, 4-2, 4-3, 4-4, and then finally where he was stored is 4-5. And that 4-5 designation was painted on the wall for him because 4 and 5 is 9. Right. That's why, in fact, they built 9 hangars on the Galileo and Sidekick levels, the 4-1 level. The 4-2 level contained the Looking Glass, Alice's glass. In fact, outside of the door for the major facility, there's a white rabbit with a clock. A very large, it's a statue that's probably about that tall, and it's held above the doorway. It's wired above the doorway. The Looking Glass, I find out, is one of the ERBs. It's an Einstein-Rosenbridge promoter. It uses some form of, and this is found out, Jesus Christ, in the last 2 weeks. I'm asking the right questions there, I guess. It's composed of a spherical, spinning, arced rectangular solid matrix of nickel, cadmium, and barium. There is a spinning disk underneath it, which is supercooled. Into this is injected into the center of these spinning, and I'm not a physicist, spinning disks, is injected an argon gas. Into that is injected some type of repulsion matter. It's a gravity repulsion matter. They are obtaining the gravity repulsion matter from the heavy materials that have been obtained from the J-rods, the 115 variety material. And apparently when they bombard it with enough electromagnetism, this stuff repels gravity and it turns into some sort of exotic matter. They spin it fast enough, it opens, or they can see through it. And that is, from what I understand, the great prize in what's going on in the world right now, are those devices.
There's been a little pushback about the case of Dan Burish, most notably from George Knapp in a 2004 article that he published in that was published in UFO magazine, which I put up on our website, so I'll link to that in the notes for this video if anybody wants to go there and read it. And then very recently at Contact in the Desert this year, he was asked on a panel about Dan Burish's claims from someone who was in the audience, and he responded in a way that was very animated, and it just seemed unusually animated. And I'll drop the clip of that audio into this video so people can hear that as well.
Hi, George. I want to just tell you how incredible I think that you've been, and I got into this because of your interview with Bob Lazar those many years ago. But I do have a question for you. There's been tremendous amount of data and evidence substantiating Dan Burish's case, that he worked at S4, and that he worked with an ET named J-Rod. And what I wanted to ask you is that much of this evidence is now coming back into light, so much so that his case was entered into public record in the last congressional hearing in November in Washington, D.C. by Michael Schellenberger. His name, Dan Burish, was said 9 times in these reports. And I wanted to ask you about a 2004 article that you wrote about him in UFO magazine.
Okay, what do you want to ask?
I wanted to ask, it seemed as if you questioned his case, you questioned his experience with the J-Rod. And I wanted to ask you if you had any more evidence or anything else that you wanted to share that might turn a light back onto Dan Burish's case.
I hope the light does get shined on him because he's completely full of crap. No disrespect to you, but I mean, I think this was an effort by Dan and a merry group of pranksters that spent many months trying to convince me that he was the real deal. And every turn that I investigated, I found it to be a bunch of baloney. His first name, when I knew him, was Dan Crane. And he pretended to be a scientist. He is not. He does not have degrees where he said he got them. And I know that that's a familiar kind of a thing for when you're talking about UFOs and Las Vegas. But I spent a lot of months looking into he and his group. And they just made stuff up. They put on costumes. I know when the movie came out, what the heck was it? It was the Da Vinci Code. The Da Vinci Code came out. And suddenly Dan Crane, who by then claimed that Dan Burish, that was his new name, by then he had claimed he had saved the world twice. He had gone to Iraq and saved the world by preventing the release of biological weapons that would have killed everybody. So he's a bit of a martyr. And then when the Da Vinci Code came out, he claimed he was part of Opus Dei. He and his group were Opus Dei. They would send me photos of Dan being driven around by his future wife. She's like driving a limo, and he's in the back in a military uniform. He's never in the military. And she gets out and lets him out in this gravel pit that's by my house, by the way. Like, this is some secret operation out here in this gravel pit. I just found it ridiculous. And they really ran a number at me that went over a number of months. They would have different letters that were sent to me by different people. Boy, I think this guy living next to me is really deep into UFOs. I saw military people come to his house and take him out in the middle of the night. It was a very elaborate attempted hoax, I think. And if there is substantial evidence that he's the real deal, I haven't seen it. So the fact that Schellenberger submitted a letter...
I don't know where you got that information. I was there. Nobody put on the record anything about him. So that's weird information.
Yeah, no offense, but I got boxes of stuff about Dan Burish. If he's for real, great. But I'm done with it.
And this is what we're up against.
What, as such a huge personality in this field, and someone who people respect, what does it mean when somebody like George Knapp says Burish's claims are nonsense and that he's not who he says he is?
Brian, do you want to take that one?
I don't know what to make of it, to be honest. He's had a lot of time since that 2004 article to maybe at times look at what had unfolded since 2004, but before the Dan's story went dark, I say around 2007, 2008, it started to kind of like recess into the background. But there was a tremendous amount of content still coming out on him. And then the Caltech speaking engagement happened. How did he proactively decide to cut all that out of what was going on in mainstream ufology at the time? And then to be asked that on stage last week, and to rather than say something to the effect of, that's interesting, I don't know what you're talking about, let's connect later, because this individual was offering some information that clearly they were aware of some information he was not aware of. And I would imagine in the spirit of investigative journalism, and especially when you're on stage, you wouldn't want to dig your heels in too deep with something that is, was written in 2004 about the potential that something came to light that could be reconsidered. So I don't know what to make of it. It bothers me.
Do you get the sense that maybe they just didn't connect in the early days, and he just got so burnt out on Dan that George left it behind and went his own way and then just never looked back? And this case may have been a real case, or maybe he just, I don't know, they
were connected. They're intimately connected. Dan invited George to some meetings he had that he was holding with some school students to teach them science. And that was the only time George acknowledged, it sounds like the guy knows what he's talking about. I was impressed. So they were very aware of each other. And then the comment on stage, you can hear that in the audio, is very point blank. He claims to be a scientist. He's not a scientist. There's going to be a lot of people that have a problem with that comment.
Well, yeah, and even in the article that he wrote, actually, even in that moment, in that comment, he talks about, he says this guy has no credentials, and then he realizes, but neither did Bob Lazar until we were able to understand why.
Yeah, and the wealth of information, a number of interviews, the number of essays, blogs, forum entries that acknowledge Dan's obvious acuity in the sciences is overwhelming. So, and I felt
to play devil's advocate, right? To push back, because people will ask, and I think it's a fair question. Dan, depending on which video you watch first of Dan, if you watch the right one, when he presents, I agree with you. He presents really well, and his story is very emotionally impactful, and you can see it in his presentation and the way his body language changes, and there's just a lot to take in. But a lot of the criticism about him seems to be that he's just weird. He's super weird. He's got a weird website that is completely unintelligible, and it makes no sense.
Yeah.
And a lot of there are a lot of videos of him that are kind of strange. And I think people are asking, rightfully so, what is up with this guy? Bob Lazar is at least, he's just a nerd. We understand that. He's not super weird. What is it about some of the stuff that's going on with Dan that seems to stand out about him that people zero in on?
I listen, he is a character. He's a personality. I can't begin to understand, based on the experiences he maybe had, how that can't affect you in some way. But in my honest opinion, if you eliminate the personality and eliminate Dan and just take him as Informer X, let's say, is making these claims, and here's his story, and here's what anecdotally supports it, and here's what's coming out now that seems to support it, and other people who worked on a program similar say the same thing, then you don't have to worry about the personality of the man. Because, it's just like Bob Lazar's case. Back in 1989, somebody talking about back engineering alien craft was absurd, and they were weighing aspects of his personality and the jobs he had on the side and things like this. Well, eliminate Bob from that equation, and let's look at what's happening now. There's anecdotal support, and now things happening in Congress that acknowledge very clearly on the record that we have back engineering programs and we have craft. So to a certain extent, when people come along and weigh too much on the personality of the individual, you're going to get yourself into a corner that is a very difficult place to get beyond. So try to look at the data, try to look at the claims, try to look at the claims of other people who worked on programs similar. And that's what I attempt to do on my website, the Burish Archive, is show a lot of other anecdotal support for the case. What do you feel about that, Martin?
Well, ufology has always been a ghetto. And by that I mean it's socially and culturally confined to the margins. Ufology 2.0 just happens to be a much bigger ghetto, but it's also, ironically, much more uniform. I think that's not least as a result of the fact that information and discussion is managed by the internet, occurs over the internet. I have a lot of problems with the idea that you can dismiss Burish while his claims are weird. That the implication of that claim is you have a sense of then what claims would be acceptable and what are standard. Well, what are they? That's never voiced. If you look at the story if you look at the stories that we now find that dominate ufology 2.1, that dominate ufology from 2017, they seem to be characterized by a very deliberate effort at what we could euphemistically call cultural management. This is a sort of cultural management that you would expect. This is one of the pressures that creates this ghetto. The others are social. But you do end up with a very sort of confined intellectual space where certain ideas are promoted, certain ideas are contained, certain ideas are denied outright. Now, when we look at someone like George Knapp, he is exactly the sort of person you think would end up participating in this form of cultural management. Now, I'm not saying that is the case, but it is something we would expect.
This is really what I'm interested in, the management of the information space around this topic, because it changes so dynamically during the period of the 90s and the early 2000s, and then it brings us into this whole new era. And I imagine that, and having been interested in it through that whole time and watching that transformation take place, I'd imagine that at this stage, the control of the information online is pretty tight and probably pretty well managed.
Yeah.
Who would be managing something like that? And can you talk more about what you mean by like managing these ideas and what's acceptable and what's not and how that works? I don't think a lot of people, and just to add an extra detail to this, I don't think a lot of people who are new to this topic really understand just to what degree it's interfered with from outside.
Good question.
So I think that's what we need to drill down on.
I think the first question to ask is, can we expect this subject to be managed? Can we expect its free unfolding? Can we expect open discussion, open disclosure? And the answer is no. We simply can't. Ufology post-2017 is characterized by official government disclosure. And the disclosure involves unimaginably powerful science and technologies, and probably more significantly, are unimaginably powerful philosophies as related to us by advanced extraterrestrial civilizations. The release of either would represent an unprecedented threat to the global power structure. They would represent irresistible forces which could outright depose the current economic, political, and military elites that govern the world. We know this. Therefore, to assume the subject is not managed is probabilistically most erroneous. In a way, it's ridiculous to assume this is a freely operating intellectual and cultural space. It's a theater. And you can see that in so many ways. You can see it from the very, very beginning, two ways. First off, the US government decides to begin disclosure with mention of a military program involved in advanced aeronautic threat identification programs. From the very beginning, they characterize it as a threat. They then release footage that's from the US Navy, again, from a militaristic vantage point, and notably from the Navy at sea. Why was it from the Navy at sea? Because that way they retain a monopoly of interpretation over the experience. Because if it happens over land, an eyewitness could have come forward and say, I saw it too, but I had this feeling of peace and love from it. And then later that night, I had extraordinary dreams. And then much later, I met an extraordinary individual. This is something that could happen. But if it happens at sea, over the horizon, they retain a monopoly of interpretation. And then you find with Ufology 2.0, what do you not see? It doesn't build on anything that's gone before. You would expect that all those people who'd been the voices in the wilderness before then would finally come forward and it would be acknowledged, you know what, you were right. All this time, everyone's laughing at you. You were right. But those voices aren't to be found. So you take someone like Timothy Good, the British researcher, very well-spoken individual, someone who's clearly a high degree of intelligence and obvious integrity. How many interviews did he do? What position did he get in the discourse? None. Instead, we've Luiz Elizondo right at the heart of it. And Luiz Elizondo, in many ways, is obviously playing a role. There are a couple of ways you see this. One, he's very studied in his interaction with people. He's very good at getting people on side. Everyone he talks to, he's got this ingratiating manner. There's these sort of verbal structures he uses to get them on side. He presents as the ultimate everyman. If you look at the biography he presents in his book, Imminent, he's everything. He seems white, but he's a person of color. He's Christian, he's also Jewish. He looks like a truck driver, but he's also highest ranking civil servant. He talks, about rainbows and ponies and love and light. He was also involved in interrogation of Guantanamo Bay. He tells everyone who listens, he tells in his book how much he loves scuba and swimming in the sea. He lives inland in Wyoming. It just doesn't add up. Doesn't add up at all. And so then he inserts himself right at the heart of the discourse. And where are we at? He's holding up photos, which are obvious, easily proven fakes. And that's in 2025, 8 years in. So he comes into the heart of the discourse, corrals so much energy, draws in so much attention. And now then you see this sort of, now that this space has been unfolded, it seems there's an effort to close it. So the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post running these articles about how it was all just just some ruse to fool people. And it's just interesting to watch it all play out.
I'm so glad that you mentioned what you just said about Elizondo, because I've been thinking that since the beginning. It just seems so obvious to me, and I was wondering if anybody else was picking up on it. But it's like, depending on his audience, the hat he's wearing will change. Yeah. If he's on Fox News, it's the 511 tactical hat. If he's on a podcast, it's the New York Yankees cap. Sometimes he's drinking a beer. Sometimes, his warrior wall up behind him with all his flags and stuff.
Yep.
It's just, he would, in the early days, he worked really hard to talk to everybody. It didn't matter if a podcast had 200 listeners. It was like he would go there and talk to everybody.
And it would always be an honor and a privilege to talk to them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And the whole
and
thing,
then we had
great question, Clint. I'm really glad you asked me that. That's really insightful. All this sort of bullshit that went on. And then he adds to it. There's this other little touch he added in. I saw him do it once, was his wife interrupts. His wife interrupts. She comes in and goes along the lines of, Lou, it's time to wind it up. It's dinner time. Something like this. And I thought, come on now.
The old ball and chain over here.
Yeah, it's just the everyman shtick.
You know how it is.
I'm doing this out of the goodness of my heart. And I think, too, he's been quite effective in basically in fooling some people. That's my sense of it.
Well, explain that some more. What is, you're talking about an information sort of gatekeeper. You're talking about an authority figure in the disclosure movement, somebody that people look up to and respect. And you've described this sort of scenario where he puts himself at the heart of this conversation, but to what end is he being managed? Is someone, is there an objective that this gets to, or is it just to confuse and annoy people and deflate them at the end? You mentioned the Wall Street Journal article. We had the New York Times article in 2017, Glowing Auras and Black Money, I think it was Leslie Kane's article. Mm-hmm. And then this Wall Street Journal article that's basically like bookending it, saying, it was all a dream. Don't worry about it. What is going on with these people? Is someone managing them? To what end? How does that work in your view?
I think it's to ensure that always all roads lead to Langley and the Pentagon.
And to eliminate the concept that people who are interested in this subject and looking for answers need to do hard research. Yeah. Right now, 2.0, I think Martin would agree. Right now, we're looking for leaders to follow that are going to lead us to the truth. And everybody who comes on and is interviewed, like a Luiz Elizondo, is projecting an image, whether it's deliberate, choreographed or not, that makes people go, okay, I'm going to follow him. Now, I'll be honest. When I got into this in 1989, research was very traditional means. You go to the library, you read books, you read other people's documentation, you find out what other researchers are studying, and you connect dots. And there wasn't character assassination nearly like it is now, where personalities are everything. It was really, it was a deliberate attempt to do solid research, connect dots, and it's hard work. It was a lot of work. But the efforts of the others around you gave substance to the material by which you're studying, even though it's really mind-blowing stuff. Because when it's mind-blowing stuff and you rely on the personalities and emotions of people that you're waiting to follow, then you're going to give up on worrying about the details and the real hardcore evidence. You're just going to go around finding out who to trust next. So
it's frustrating because it's like you, as a person looking at it, waiting for disclosure or something to happen. Mm-hmm. You see people like, you've got Elizondo, you've got Jake Barber, there's Danny Sheehan. There's a few people who seem to be really trying to fight the good fight, but I don't know who to trust. I just don't. I feel like I'm always like, it always, there's an element of it that just feels planned. It feels like scripted. Like News Nation, I don't know. I feel like News Nation just came up out of nowhere one day, and now they are like the source. It's like everything that goes out in the podcast circuit on YouTube is originating from the same source, which is kind of weird, I think.
Yeah, they're stripping down the sources to the core that are being discussed on podcasts. And without lots of documentation and support evidence and good research. I don't know how you feel about that, Martin. That's just talking about the old days, what it used to be to where it is now. I've seen that trajectory. It's different.
Yeah. You're absolutely right, Brian, in what you say there. What I also see is, to just take the step back and look at that big picture. What I noticed is that with ufology between 1.0 and 2.0 is that the field seemed to darken, is how I put it, in that it did seem pre-2017 that the notion of disclosure would be this tremendous liberatory force for all of humanity. And that idea is, to me at least, is fallen by the wayside somewhat. I notice with current ufology and the discussion that goes on, the two ideas are never discussed. And these are ideas seem obvious and attendant to acknowledgement of an extraterrestrial presence. And they are one, you'll note there is no incessant demand for the release of recovered technologies and materials. This is quite unusual because in the first instance, these are not the property of Lockheed Martin or Boeing or whatever company has them locked away in some unacknowledged special access program. These are, property, the gift of all citizens of the US, or maybe just the peoples of the world. And secondly, these science and technologies, by all account, could offer extraordinary technological reprieve for many of the conditions that beset us. These are sort of technologies, particularly in the area of energy generation. They could lift billions of people out of poverty and could go a long way to allowing us to begin to heal the environment and build a sustainable future for all of us. So that's one thing you notice, that there's just that demand does not get heard. It's you don't hear people saying, okay, it's time to cut the bullshit and get right through this. You pointing fingers at the groups have sciences and technologies you shouldn't have, and you need to release them. And don't tell me they're so dangerous to threaten all of humanity. Why don't we put them out there into the forum and talk about them before we make that decision? That's one point. And the second idea you don't hear much of comes to this discussion of human motivation. Now, again, here I see an awful lot of cultural management. I see this in the form of the position of Jacques Vallée in the discussion, the likes of Diane Pasulka, reference to angels, demons, jinn, interdimensional, on and on and on and on. You have this sort of march into the mysterious, this march into the area of here be dragons and demons. And once you do that, you empower the security state. Once you do that, you empower those who would see a threat and who would fight a threat. When it comes to motivation, there is a really simple way to discover motivation of any intelligent being. You can ask them. So what you notice again in the subject is you don't see any move to bypass the power structures. These are extraterrestrial civilizations. We're human beings on the planet. Our freedoms are not to be managed and curated by security state systems. This all seems attendant to the discovery of extraterrestrial civilization. But what I notice is that what Ufology 2.2, it lays down tracks. It creates schemas, which are frameworks to organize information along the lines Brian said. And what they all tend to do is encourage passivity and encourage ignorance, encourage this almost feudal-like disposition amongst human beings, that we have to wait for our overlords to dish out what they know. We have to wait for overlords to decide when it's safe to promulgate certain technologies. And we're going to allow our overlords navigate our relationship with the greater cosmos.
You make a really interesting point there, because it seemed very clear to me that a few years ago, we were having a very focused, substantive discussion about legislation with actual teeth on it that would go into these programs and private companies and get the technology. I mean, the Schumer Amendment, as it was originally written, had included eminent domain. They were going to send in attorneys and investigators in to go find this stuff and sort out what was real and what wasn't. And it seemed like there was an actual plan there that had a real bones to it. And now, and then that didn't happen. And then it was sort of like, yada, yada, yada. Now we're talking about angels and demons and meditating in the desert and summoning orbs. And it seems like we've gotten away from anything that is substantive, and we're chasing, like you said, these weird, it's this woo thing. This is it angels or demons, or is it something else?
And then,
but to push back on that a little bit, do you think that could be that we're just getting better understanding of what we're dealing with, and it's a broader thing than we thought it was? Could it be that?
Yeah, but I think it's been broadened out. But what we're losing sight of the fact you're dealing with, physical intelligent beings who have a physical intelligent expression, and then there is this imposition of the notion of malevolence onto the phenomenon that the evidence doesn't quite support. I mean, alongside that, what we've spoken about already, you have then this notion of 2027, which again further pacifies people. It further weakens them, because what we tend to do is we postpone our hope for the resolution of our questions to this data to 2027. And again, we have this notion of a threat associated with 2027. If you get into it, if you drill down to all the claims regarding 2027, a good number involve this idea of, to quote Bledsoe, like an approaching armada. And again, this would require that whatever science and technologies are under wrap and key remain under wrap and key, because they need to be weaponized. And again, this notion of an approaching armada would encourage us to just give further unquestioned support for our power structures. Again, people are disempowered, they're weakened, and they remain in a position which you could characterize fairly as neo-feudal or a peasantry.
Well, I think, isn't Bledsoe saying that it's going to be like a contact event? Not so much an armada, but it's an unveiling, or a...
You used the
these
term
beings
armada.
are going to reveal themselves.
He used it twice.
Is that what the term...
Yep, he did.
I thought he was saying that it was going to be this peaceful, wonderful thing, and we're all going to be thrilled with it, and it's just a beautiful thing, and we should all trust it. He seems very positive with regards to what's coming.
That's what I heard too. I heard the same.
Well, the word he used, I can't remember which podcast it was, but he twice referenced the term armada. Armada, of course, it's a reference to the Spanish fleet, which was purposed to the conquest of Britain. I mean, Bledsoe's claims aside, if you just look around the field, you do hear a lot of claims that 2027 will represent some sort of alien invasion / intervention / arrival. And now if you look to the voices which have said that, I think first among those are Daniel Sheehan himself. Daniel Sheehan is, of course, well connected to both Greer and, ironically, to Elizondo, and I think, and the Catholic Church. And I think Daniel Sheehan, when he speaks, he does speak with a great degree of intelligence and I think an understanding derived from those contacts. And he said, yes, we are on the brink of an intervention. Now, interestingly, Stephen Greer said the same. He said, I think it was last year in a talk, he said his sources had told him by the end of 2026, I think at the latest, or 2027, we would see the extraterrestrial forces act against us. And then if you look into maybe to less significant figures in the field, maybe people like John Stewart, who was associated with the Victor interview, again, he said he's had a number of people, including his DARPA scientists, tell him, there is an invasion imminent.
But what does that mean, that these people have a connection to information from the future? Because on one hand, it's easy to bring it back to Burish and the idea of looking glass in the Orion Cube, and that they foresaw these things long ago. Would these be the same resources that these people are getting their information from? I don't think so with Chris Bledsoe. I'm sure people see him as having individual extraterrestrial contact, and that's how he's getting his information.
Well,
but people on the inside and in the intelligence, where are they getting this from?
Well, Brian, what I would do is I'd separate out the Dan Burish story from just this discussion of the field as a whole. And what I'm just noting that with Ufology 2.0, this meme of 2027 has been advanced. And what you'll notice, again, is how this meme seems to promulgate. You notice how it seemed to spread through the field. Now, earlier, I characterized the field as a ghetto. That includes the notion that there's an awful lot of bad thinking going on. And you see it here with the discussion of 2027. If you listen closely to these interviews, and when people admit where they got this notion from, it's secondhand. So even Bledsoe himself, this is important to note. In that interview where he talks about an armada, he said he got told by a NASA scientist.
Oh, I did not know that.
This might have been because I thought Bledsoe's prediction came from the lady, his vision of the lady.
Yeah, he has, but you see,
this
is another interesting part of Ufology 2.0, and that is you'll notice these unfolding claims. The eyewitness doesn't come forward, or the whistleblower doesn't come forward with a story. They tell the story and they walk away. That's what you see largely with Burish, and that's what you see wholly with Dan Sherman, for example. They have a story, they tell it, and they're gone. What you see with Ufology 2.0 is people insert themselves in the field and stay in the field, and their story evolves. There's more and more details come along. Now, first among these would be someone like Whitley Strieber. He has been a prominent voice for a long time, but somehow, some ways, he's constantly adding in new details into his stories. He's linking them to other things. Elizondo, incidentally, does something much similar. If you look at his claims over time, you compare what you find in his book Imminent with the sort of things he was saying initially, there's this unfolding testimony. Now, I think in the case of Elizondo, this is quite deliberate. I think in the case of Bledsoe, this is unintentional. I think Bledsoe is a very, very decent man. I don't think he would tell a lie intentionally, but I would dare say he may well be quite naive in dealing with some of the people he's with. He's a toddler in a pool of sharks.
I think that's the other thing that a lot of people who are fresh to the topic don't realize is to what degree UFO groups had been infiltrated in the past, or people have been approached by whoever, clandestine agencies, and steered in one direction or another. It's a polluted environment, and it's really hard to know what information is solid enough that you can build on it. And I think to some degree, the 2027 thing, I attribute some of the memes to sort of the podcast industrial complex, if you will. It's like there's a thirst for content, and YouTube is always pushing content creators to have something fresh.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever a new talking point shows up, especially in this space because it's so small, it does spread pretty quickly. But it's interesting to me where a lot of this stuff comes from. The first person I heard talk about a date was John Lear on George Knapp's program, actually, many years ago. And he was saying that they had a date. It was in the near future, next 5 years, I think, at the time. And this would have been in the late 80s.
Yeah.
And then I remember Carla Turner talked about how there were so many dates that none of them ever really happened. Nothing happened. And she took that to mean there's some deception happening.
Yeah.
That's what I relate to from these early days. We constantly every year heard, we're hearing rumblings in DC. We think disclosure is right around the corner, or something big is going to happen. Yeah. It was constant. So I've heard of enough of it personally.
To me, it does sort of track, though. I mean, it seems reasonable, right? Like to think that, especially going back, Martin, to your jumping off point with this whole topic, if let's say Club of Rome, for example, they said by 2050 we'll be in ecological free fall or collapse, or whatever their predictions at the time said was going to happen, and then you've got climate change, global pollution, all of the different compounding issues that we're dealing with that we can see, and they're very real. But the projections on all those seem to get to about 2050, and then they kind of say, okay, after that, it's just catastrophe. Unless we do something huge. And with AI and artificial superintelligence, those predictions were 2045, 2050. Now they're getting to 2037, 2030, somewhere in there. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is it seems like as a species, we have about 3 or 4 ticking clocks that are all going to run out right around the same time. Is it not reasonable to assume that at some point, if there is a non-human intelligence overseeing our whole situation here, that they would step in and intervene? And if they're going to do it, wouldn't it make sense to do it soon? And would that not be connected to these global issues that we're talking about?
Well, just on the Club of Rome, if we can just take a step back, it's worth looking at the Club of Rome report. And again, for people who are tuning in or not familiar with it, the Club of Rome was a group of industrial nations, and they, following the Yom Kippur War in 1973, commissioned a report which made use of the most advanced computers available at that time, and it was an attempt to model our world system in terms of our environment and our economy. And what they did was they looked at a number of trends, and they included in population, pollution, goods produced per capita, services produced per capita, food produced per capita. And so what they did was they looked at past use and past developments of the past trends that applied, and then they projected them forward. Now, the projections forward ran right through to the end of the 21st century. What they foresaw was that approximately around the year 2030, human population would peak. And then human population would fall because pollution reached such a level, because finite resources had been drawn down to such a point that would lead to declining food per capita production, goods per capita production, service per capita production. Now, what is fascinating about the Club of Rome report is that those predictions and projections have all been tested. Have all been tested by the history of the last 50 odd years. And what you find is that the predictions that they made through the 70s, for the 80s, 90s, first decades of the 21st century, they all held true. They all held. Some of them were uncannily accurate. Some of them were just slightly off. But the general direction, the overall directionality of the model held up. The director of the model, I think, was a man by the name of McDonald. I may have that wrong. But he in later years, or in recent years, he's given a number of talks about the Club of Rome model, and he's been asked, why does it speak more about its accuracy and what it found and what it predicted for us? And he said, there's absolutely no point. No one listens. Now, to that, you mentioned AI, and then here's an interesting speculation. The best data sets available to environmental science and the best computer systems available are held by the security state. The US Navy, for instance, knew about the thinning of the Arctic over 40 years before mainstream science knew about it. Nuclear submarines underneath the ice cap would measure the ice caps for obvious reasons, and the US Navy knew it was thinning, knew the rate at which it was thinning decades ahead of mainstream science. Given the surveillance technologies available to the US military and its allies, we can assume that their overall sense of the condition of the environment is much more accurate than that is available to the mainstream environment. And with that, with the computer systems and AI we can assume they've much more effectively modeled what is happening and what is likely to happen. And in that context, then what we may see is that the claim for 2020 may be inaccurate as is presented within Ufology 2.0, but speaks to a deeper truth that the control is purpose too. In other words, if there's a sense of, say, wholesale ice cap collapse, maybe in the later part of this decade, then there is a need to ensure social and economic continuity up until that point to allow for suitable readiness and preparation. To secure that, then you need to dampen down the potential revolutionary power that is contained in something like disclosure in the form of a release of these science and technologies, or in the form of widespread gleaning of an extraterrestrial philosophy, which may undermine any elite preparation for this future they see coming into view.
That's a really fascinating point, because it sounds like you're saying that just the injection of fresh knowledge and ideas and technology into the current ecosystem of our society would be an unstable element at a time when the control group could not handle that. It would be too unstable. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, this is, to just think about it more simply, this is by far the most explosive element of this entire subject. People, I think Ufology 2.0 succeeds in distracting people. We have radar returns and tracking and infrared and photographs, videos, and all the like. You've claims for how these technologies work. You've claims for what these technologies can do. And that's all interesting. Yes, it is. And the technologies and sciences, yes, they would change the world. But I don't think that compares to the effect of what would happen to our world if we could see a human-like extraterrestrial. Like what?
I feel like it would be the social equivalent of like the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and the collapse of the Soviet Union, but 10 times bigger and all at once. It would just be mind-boggling.
I think culturally it could be a neutron bomb. Neutron bombs, of course, they kill all life and leave the physical structure standing. I think it could be a cultural neutron bomb, and that it kills everything we think we know and understand, and it completely reshapes what we feel. Like, for instance, it could be like this, is that people start asking them, well, how come your world is so advanced? And then they begin to spell it out how they did it. And then someone may ask, well, what do you do with money? How do you have a finance system? They say, we don't have credit banking. That's insane. We don't allow a tiny minority garner the most of the fruits of your economic development and growth. We recognize that we're all inherently divine, or we're all inherently aspects of consciousness, and that so our politics respects that. We don't wage war. It's completely banned on our planet. And on and on and on. And then this then becomes immediately is that you could have our economic system is thrown into very profound question immediately. Our politics and our geopolitics is just, refashioned out of sight in a very, very rapid way. And of course, that prospect is enormously threatening to the beneficiaries of our economic system.
So a society that would be obviously older and superior to our own, just the existence of it, just the acknowledgement that that is a real thing, would be enough to have everyone questioning the status quo here.
Yeah, because it's going to go from initially, hello, how are you, to, well, what does your world look like? How do you do it? And maybe say, look, we were once like you. Our world once looked like yours. But then we made all these changes and now look at it. And humanity as a whole might look at this and go, yes, this is the way. Let's do this. And we might actually turn to an extraterrestrial civilization and say, we need your help. We actually need guidance. Will you help us govern ourselves? There are all these sort of possibilities. And then there are also the possibilities which are maybe even more destabilizing when we start asking, well, what is the history of the planet? What do you know? What can you tell us about the truth of the various religions on our planet? I mean, this is all explosive stuff. But
suddenly there's another authority on all of this stuff.
That presumes that we would have instantly a relationship of exchange of these questions and ideas. I mean, we're really playing science fiction movie right now. Right now, the culture by which we live in is completely unconditioned to anything destabilizing like that. If we were to have an extraterrestrial presence, let's say in 2027,
yep.
we operate humanly. We operate through conditioning of things we can relate to. If we're up against something that's outside of our realm of understanding, we're going to dig deep to find something that it relates to, and this is going to be a very difficult one. So I don't think, depending on how it comes about, of course, I don't think it would go well at all. I think we would just be grasping to try to figure out what this even means, and we'll probably dip into our knowledge of pop culture and movies and things like that to try to give some sort of relationship, because we will be left trying to grasp at any understanding of it.
I wonder what you would say. I mean, is it your sense, Martin, that the species or beings or intelligences behind all of this, that it's just one, or are there multiple different types in your view? And would they all, if there are more than one type that we're dealing with, is it safe to assume that they all have one motivation, or are they motivated by different things?
I admit that my views on the subject have evolved a lot and continue to evolve. And I'm likely to contradict myself at a point in the future. The second thing I'd note is that the phenomenon presents as a system which is complex in the classical sense, in that present there are critical variables we have not yet identified. There are critical relationships that are invisible to us, and the critical dynamics that we don't understand. And moreover, those aspects of its complexity also impact non-human intelligence, insofar as that, to speak simply, for our mysterious aliens, there will be mysterious aliens. In other words, just as a result of the enormous scales in time and space, and you will then see that with the phenomenon as a whole, with this question of intelligent life in the universe, staggering complexity that allows for a number of, I suppose, competing narratives and allow for almost a contradiction, which won't easily be resolved.
I mean, I guess that's really the heart of the question here, right? Is what we're dealing with inherently positive, negative, neutral, or some mixture of both? That, assumption is that within the American military, corporate, whatever apparatus that is administering this program, people have made contacts. They have made, a history of communication with at least some of these beings. So they probably do know the answers to why they're here, what they want, what they're after, whether or not they're good or bad. The pushback against this idea that they're a peaceful civilization that wants the best for us would be, we don't know what we're dealing with. And how can we assume that if we don't know what we're dealing with? And isn't it more prudent to take a cautious approach and be more suspicious until we know more? What is your take? You do have somebody like Stephen Greer saying, they are fine. They're peaceful. They don't want any trouble with us. It's us that we have to worry about.
There's not one type. We know that. There's not one type. And if we're to learn anything from the authenticity of the experiencers of various types, whether they're contactees or abductees, there's a wide variety of agendas at hand. And there's a wide variety of interpretations of what they're doing that sometimes, Dr. Gary Nolan talks about this. We take a look at some things that are being done and we innately think it's negative when actually it might be positive in the end. So it's difficult to comprehend some of the details of these experiences. but I think it'd be safe to assume that there's a variety of different agendas, and they're not all one bundled together concept of a purpose.
So let me ask you a different question then, because you said earlier something along the lines of, I can remember exactly how you phrased this. You were talking about the way the information is managed in the space, and Luiz Elizondo specifically, and how he presents, right? Since Luiz Elizondo has come into the scene, we've seen others appear. Most recently, Matthew Brown has come out as a whistleblower. Before him, there was Jake Barber. And I want to spend a second on Jake Barber because he started this group called Skywatcher. And this is made for television. A bunch of former military, highly trained special forces guys that ostensibly worked on crash retrieval and recovery programs coming together. At least this is the story we're being told, in the civilian world for the benefit of mankind to do this thing where they're going to go out and make these craft appear somehow using their skills, and then something is supposed to happen. It seems like a Hollywood movie. It seems very scripted, but what do you make of that group? They seem like they're trying to find some real answers, and they seem very methodical in there.
Brian, do you want to?
I just find myself so easily leaning into being jaded, and I have to be honest with myself. What they may be doing may have exactly the outcome we were all hoping for. I get it. I know it sounds too good to be true. They're channeling, they're connecting with craft, they're inventorying their different styles and shapes and trajectories, and eventually they said it themselves. They're hoping that they're going to bring one down. They're going to get all these data sources at the same time showing that it's happening. And they're doing it through the spirit of almost like citizen science. We don't need to wait for NASA. We don't need to wait for any XYZ Air Force division to do this. Hell, we're just going to do it ourselves. I love that. I have to be honest.
That sounds
great.
To me, that's it. Like, that's the era we're in right now. This is the citizen moment. This is the punk rock ufology moment where the technology is good enough that you can buy it off the shelf a lot of times. And if you know what you're doing, you can probably go out and try to.
And it fits perfectly with a demographic of your younger generation right now who is epically uncomfortable trusting anything the government is doing right now. And more than ever, we're living in a time when conspiracy is believable. So they look at this and go, okay, this probably is pretty authentic.
It just feels like there's been this weird shift lately where especially with Jake Barber and Skywatcher, Carl Nell appeared at this SALT conference speaking, and he said this famous quote where he said, "There's zero doubt." When he was asked, how do you know, or are we alone, and are there other intelligence here? And he goes, "There's zero doubt." And then he does this really dramatic pause, and he looks out over the crowd, and that quote was like just an anvil being dropped in the middle of an orchestra pit. It was just weird. And then you have this weird sort of fusion between these UFO researchers and this Silicon Valley group of hedge fund people, venture capitalists, tech guys. It almost seems like people are so used to the government not getting anything done that they're looking now towards this private group to just come forward and make something happen.
There's been a number of those in the past, by the way.
But have any of them accomplished anything? And is Skywatcher any different in any meaningful way from what you guys see?
I don't know what their downfall is. I just know quite a number of very polished, sophisticated, organized companies who pitch this idea that they're going to build craft on our own. We don't need to wait for, we've got significant financial backing. We're hiring the right people. Yeah, I can point you to some. This isn't new.
It's just this idea that the narrative is being managed, right? Like, okay, let's assume that it is. And let's assume that for a second, Jake Barber and Skywatcher are part of that. Well, to what end would that, what have they done? They've come out and they've classified these, like, was it 7? I think 7 different categories, 7 or 9. I don't remember what the number exactly, but of types of craft that they're seeing based on performance characteristics. They've got footage of all these. Mm-hmm. They've got sensor data on this stuff. They're taking psionic assets out into the desert and having them make contact. I guess every step of that is what I would expect a proper disclosure process to look like. And then at the end, I guess what I would be expecting is like close encounters, like a ship lands and somebody walks up to it.
But also what's important to identify that is happening, if you're going to be honest with yourself and witness what they're doing, they're involving a almost spiritual connection with the phenomenon, because they're even though they have a device called the dog whistle, what we're left to believe, however, is still there is this conscious connection that we're going to have with this phenomenon, and we're going to connect and take control. But that's never happened in the past, as far as I'm aware. And that in the eyes of some people can see is almost like a connection with a spiritual being.
It's weird. Like, we go from discs, metallic discs, landing and people getting out of them, walking down a ramp and standing outside, and then bringing other people on board. Like, I've got stacks of books of stories of people who've had those encounters. Then Skywatcher comes along and they're like, guess what? No discs. It's these things. They look like an arrowhead. It's a little blob that looks like a jellyfish. It's actually nothing like any of the stuff you've been looking at for the last 40 years.
Yeah, temper that. I was told that the only reason it's not discs yet is because they haven't seen a disc. They're only inventorying what they've witnessed, in all honesty. I don't know why I haven't seen a disc as they're a little graphic yet either. Because it's like, well, come on, you've got to have seen this, or a cigar. No, they're seeing jellyfish. They're seeing all kinds of weird stuff.
I guess that's what's frustrating. Is like, I don't know what I'm looking. Am I looking at these guys? Am I looking at them while they're revealing that they're discovering this stuff in real time, or is this some kind of like planned psyop thing where at the end they Lucy the football and we all just go home and feel defeated? You know what I mean? Like, it feels like that's happened so many times. I'm trying to figure out if this moment is different and if there is going to be a resolution of some kind at the end, whether that's in 10 years or 20 years or whatever.
Go ahead, Martin.
Well, I think their function declares their purpose. I think these movements can often serve as sinks for time, energy, and attention. And that, again, if you point to this idea of cultural management, you would expect such things. I'm not saying this is the case in this instance, but when you mention an effort in 2025 to identify craft type, craft structure, what immediately came to my mind was a schematic that was released, I think, back in the 60s or 70s. It may have been Russian, which was exactly that. It showed a whole series of outlines and profiles of craft. And what I then think is, here we are 50 years later doing the same thing. And this is what ufology 2.0 seems to do, is this constant retardation of what would be a natural process of discovery and disclosure. Like, for example, Carnell can say, yes, 100% there are extraterrestrial intelligence. Well, okay, what did they say? What do they have to say for themselves? Did they just appear and that's it? So it seems to me...
Well, that's the part of this thing that is so weird. It's like, at the same time in my brain, right? And I know you guys are in the same spot too. You have to keep two things running at the same time. On the one hand, there's this knowledge that, and we know it's true, that there is a extremely well-funded reverse engineering and retrieval program. The CIA is involved, the Office of Global Access. The footprint of this thing has got to be magnificent. I can't imagine it's a tiny, tiny group. It's got to be huge. There's just, I think back to like Weygand, John Weygand, the Marine who was in Peru, and he talks about how many people showed up, how many helicopters and airplanes showed up in the middle of the jungle to take one craft. So on the one hand, we have like this program is real, it's working, and you have people coming forward saying, I worked on it, and it's up and running. And then you have this other group over here that's like, we don't know what's going on. No one knows. And maybe we'll see some orbs today. Let's go out and look for orbs. Let's start meditating and see what we find.
Well,
and I feel like a really weird disconnect between those two things. How can it be that they don't know what's going on and that there's this program that's been running for 60, 70 years?
Well, it's interesting that you mention the mechanics of the management of this subject, because that's something else which recommends Dan Sherman's story, because he is the only eyewitness or whistleblower to come forward who offered a very compelling account of how the institutional mechanics of this would work. To summarize his claim is that he pointed to the fact that these programs are nestled within each other like Russian dolls. And he talked about the idea you'd have a white program, or you would have a gray program inside a black program, inside a white program. And so this then explains how the mechanics of this can unfold in a way that doesn't cause, mass and open question in an institution such as the US Air Force. In other words, as they're moving helicopters here and there, you need explanations for this that are compelling to the people involved. And Sherman, to my mind, offered an explanation which explains the great science you find there, which explains how this could happen with so many people involved, with so little then being said. To Nell's claims, if we just return to that, it does seem to me quite extraordinary that in all this admission of contact with extraterrestrials, including Russia's mention of agreements with extraterrestrial groups, there just seems to be no push at all for more detail there on what it is they said, who they are, what they are. Like focusing on the pilots rather than the craft is something which I think we could reasonably expect to happen, but instead we're back focusing at the craft, back taking pictures, back building up profiles. And also, again, when you mentioned this, the psionic aspects, we're again back onto the magical mystery tour. That's how it seems to me too often, that we're losing sight of the fact that we could be dealing with just an intelligent civilization which is physically expressed. Not saying those other things aren't true, not saying those other things don't have value, but that core fact gets overlooked.
I think that's a great point. I mean, it sounds like you're not subscribing really too much to that idea right now, that the telepathy and the consciousness aspect of it is at the core of this. Is that true? Is that fair?
No, I think it is. I think the question of consciousness is at the core of this topic, but it's not the only element that's there at the core. I think socially, for civilization as a whole, the key elements include the sciences and technologies which are material, which pertain to energy generation. That's one. And two, the fact that we could be exposed to the philosophies and thinking of an advanced civilization, which would prove themselves to be extraordinarily revolutionary, not least if they impart to us a fresh evolutionary impetus. Both of those aspects of the subject are largely closed from view. I think this is deliberate as a result of the ongoing management of the subject.
There's an anthropologist by the name of Sebastian Junger, and he wrote a book called Tribe.
Yeah.
And in that book, he talked about in the early colonial United States, when occasionally people would get separated or lost in the woods, or they would be abducted by an indigenous tribe and then later rescued or found, that those white settlers almost never wanted to return to the colonies. They preferred the lifestyle that they were living with the Native Americans because it was so much more egalitarian. And it was just a better life. And it got me, it started me down this idea, this thinking of this line of thinking of like, well, if you had a superior civilization, that's the most dangerous thing to the power structure for sure. People just choose that. That could be the end of our entire culture as we know it.
And getting back to the Club of Rome report, just look at the time there. Fundamentally, the notion is we are in a terminal condition. We are collectively on our deathbed.
Do you believe that personally? What's your thought?
It seems that's what the evidence suggests. But again, we are students of Dan Burish, and I accept his claim that the future isn't predetermined. We still have, I think, the freedom to change that outcome. I think it seems likely at this point in time, but the future is largely undetermined. I mean, what we do find, if you look at the environment, when it's given any chance to recover from human depredation, what we see is often extraordinary and near miraculous. If you look into the Burish claims, for instance, they talk about the discovery of that oil-eating bacteria in the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf of Mexico should have been devastated by the spill there by Deepwater Horizon, but somehow there was this fresh bacteria emerged and reduced the oil levels there to an extraordinary.
What is can you explain that claim? I actually live on the Gulf of Mexico, and I was here when that happened. I remember the whole Deepwater Horizon thing, and it was a big scandal at the time. I was unfamiliar with the connection between Dan Burish and Deepwater. What is that connection?
Well, Brian, it was in the Moneypenny.
Yeah, it was in that. It was in the claims of this individual who kind of created a manifesto that this person on X read. And I wasn't familiar with it either. However, when I looked into some of my archives, there was something off the coast of Florida called Blackwater. And I haven't looked into that, but maybe there was a misinterpretation of that. And the idea that the Ganesh particle and that this form of science that uses micro wormholes and portals somehow affected an ecological disaster, I couldn't connect that.
I have trouble with that.
I didn't quite get how that works. What was inferred?
Well, if we can just take a few steps back, you asked me like what my sense is of the human future. I said it's uncertain. It's still within our gift to control. I made the point, even if you look at the extensive damage we've done to the environment itself has shown an extraordinary capacity to recover. An instance of that recovery was mentioned in this whistleblower document that came forward, which spoke about how about the discovery of, there was a form of, I think it was bacteria, which consumed a lot of the oil waste in the Gulf following the Deepwater Horizon catastrophe. Now, that's known to mainstream science. The claim in that report is that bacteria emerged from some sort of project Burish was involved in. I mean, that's a speculation, but the presence of, I think it was that bacteria, is a fact. And the recovery of the Gulf is another fact. And it's just alongside a whole series of extraordinary recoveries that nature can make when given the chance. You see this in fish stocks, you see it around Chernobyl, you see it all over the world, which then indicates that if humanity makes a quick change in some of the technologies it makes use of to support itself, then the environment could make a suitable quick recovery.
I mean, I think it seems reasonable enough to assume that whatever motivates these NHI, it has to be something sufficiently global, right? I mean, if they're here, they must have, if they're from somewhere else, they obviously have bases of operations here. They have to, right? Mm-hmm. And if we're endangering the biosphere of the planet, and that's what they're concerned with, the biological diversity of the planet, then certainly we've put that in danger in a number of different ways. If it's not that, it could be, that we're geoengineering our own atmosphere by putting so much carbon into it and changing the chemistry of the ocean. I could see that. That makes sense. And then the AI question, all happening on the same timeline, whether or not, if we create an artificial superintelligence, they are going to have to contend with that. And that's not going to be at our level. It's going to be exponentially more intelligent by the minute. That seems like the most unstable element. If I were an NHI, I'd be very concerned about what the humans are inventing next. What do you guys think?
Well, yeah, the biggest concern is nuclear.
Nuclear is, yeah,
huge.
Or a nuclear accident, right? Something's kicking off a.
Yeah, I mean, the claim is that our meddling in nuclear affairs is a quantum level issue. It's not just local to issues here in our own landscape. It affects the universe, and it's dangerous in that way.
And that's made. I think the first credible claim for that argument is the reports of what the Orions or Nordics said at the Holloman Treaty negotiations. They made that very point, is that you don't understand nuclear weapons or nuclear energy. It is destructive in ways you can't imagine, and we needed to stop it immediately, stop all use of nuclear energy, stop detonating nuclear weapons. But again, like within the Burish understanding, these represented future humans coming back to us. And in that schema, they do point out that for humanity, there are a number of timelines. And we are, by Burish's last claim, we are firmly situated within timeline 1. And we have avoided the timeline 2. And again, it's an interesting discussion in and of itself. But along timeline 1, there is the dangers of variance 83. And from the consistory notes, you see variance 82 and 84. And these raise the threat, raise the possibility of nuclear war, or even limited nuclear war, which would be catastrophic for humanity.
Can you, in really basic terms for people who don't know the minutia of the Burish saga, because it is so deep, can you explain kind of what you're talking about? I mean, multiple timelines, different variations. You talked about the cube, the Orion Cube earlier, Brian. Can we just paint a picture for the layman so they understand, like, Dan Burish's claims come from not just thin air. There's a whole story here. Can you tie that together?
Yeah, well, beginning with his acuity in the science and microbiology, early on, even before he knew he was dealing with off-world beings. He was seeing tissue samples and studying and saying, these seem to feel mammalian. It seems like what you're showing me has a human connection in its genetics and its DNA. So then when it was revealed who it is, and it was this species called a J-rod, he realized this is an advanced human being, because on a very biological level, a very genetic level, this is a future human. So he first proved that part. So then it was a matter of understanding the broader program at hand, where they were actually time travelers, and they were coming back here to try to repair a genetic issue that was going to affect humanity's future that they were trying to fix. And with that, we came into ownership of some technologies provided to us that allowed us to peek into the future. And we were seeing future events. And in one operation, Dan was called in 2007 to be part of a 6-month program with a team of people who are going to look at every single possible future scenario. And they saw a number of different kind of outcomes post 2012, because 2012 seemed to have been the crossover period when after that, anything's possible. And they saw one that they called Timeline 1 Variation 83, which saw the election of, again, this is 2007, the future election of Hillary Clinton, a collapse of the stock market, nuclear war. And they specifically, I think, even said things like it was going to be between China and Israel and Iran. And there would also, though, there'd be cataclysms that happen naturally because of sun activity and pole shifts and all kinds of stuff. But that outcome would have been understood well in advance. And that's why we built the subterranean infrastructure, which seems very clear today. You don't have to get into conspiracy. We have a significant subterranean infrastructure around the world that has everything we need to live for a future. And then some of us went off planet to avoid this catastrophe as best as we could. So then humanity splits into two kinds of forms. Those who went underground, their evolutionary change causes a larger head and larger eyes. The ones who went off planet end up being the tall Orions, but both have a connection back to humanity, and that their visitation now is representing a kind of caution for future events. And apparently we bypassed the Timeline 1 Variation 83 post 2012 because those things didn't exactly happen. But we're sitting here today in 2025 going, well, it sounds like some of this might happen. I mean, we're talking about we might be at the edge of a nuclear war. Environment's not looking good. So I almost feel like if I had access to Dan, I said, what was the backup plan that happened?
What actually did happen?
What was phase 2 you didn't tell us about?
Did Dan ever talk about what the form was that this information took when they were exposed to it? Was it like a hologram? Was it a telepathic thing? Like, what is it?
The 2007 project was specifically, and I had to correct myself because there's some presentations I've made where I thought it was looking glass technology, which had components of being able to see into the future. But that was supposedly extremely dangerous. It would open wormholes in the process. Yeah. The Orion Cube, Yellow Book as he called it, he said it's an 8-inch by 8-inch cube that when connected consciously, and this gets into the Jake Barber's thing a little bit, when connected consciously to certain individuals had this ability to connect with it, they could actually see collectively future events in some form.
Wow. So is it also part of the story that this cube was taken around the world and given to the top, like whoever the most powerful?
So and Martin knows from listening to this new kind of person that, I don't know if we call him a whistleblower, but he says aspects of these future technologies, these aspects of technologies that look into the future have been executed in a more granular sense. And there's many of them that are being used around the world regularly now, lots of them, including in corporate sectors where they're developing product lines where they can see how well humans adapt to new product lines and whether or not a product line idea is going to work or not. It's bizarre.
You're saying they have more than one cube?
Well, not the cube. It sounds like, and I'm only basing this on this late person here, which There's a lot of holes in his story too. He claims that there's been a proliferation of this technology in a smaller form that has been distributed in many. Like the Orion Cube, I think there was one originally, but I think there was some sort of probably, I don't know, back engineering, but there's more than one of these now. And they're being used by leadership to forecast where their futures are going. Martin, do you have anything to add to that story? Did I get pretty right? Because you were deep into the forums that I were with Dan, and you were reading and seeing the same material I was back in the day.
Yeah, I think it's important, Brian, that we remember we're a lot more familiar with this story than most. I think it's what I'll do is I'll just try and maybe capture what are the themes which distinguish Burish from other people. It might help. My initial attraction to Burish, as I said, was based on the novelty and complexity of ideas, and these involve reference to timelines. And the interesting thing is any notion of traveling faster than the speed of light involves traveling through time. What you find even in the accounts of contact and with extraterrestrials that you find in Ufology 1.0 and even through Ufology 2.0, there is reference to time travel. You find a lot of this. Now, most recently, you've had intriguing claims come from the likes of Diana Pasulka, who speaks of what Timothy Taylor told her. Now, Timothy Taylor, of course, is her chief contact. He was the launch manager at NASA involved in biotechnology. And he's someone who's seemingly had extraordinary interactions with the phenomenon and also extraordinary experiences. Now, what he told her, he referenced the fact that on Earth there is a hierarchy and that there are, between human beings and non-human intelligence, there are certain factions of the intelligence community. Now, he didn't expand on that point, but he did mention the fact that he reports to someone he calls the Hammer. This is a reference to the movie The Adjustment Bureau. Now, for those of you not familiar with the movie, it's just based on the premises that there is an angelic adjustment bureau, which is present here in the world and monitors our lives to ensure that they conform with God's plan for the world. In other words, to ensure that our lives follow their destiny. And they interact and intervene in ways subtle and not so subtle to make that happen. It's an interesting movie and a good movie, but it was fascinating that Timothy Taylor made the claim that his sense of what he was trying to do was manage our timelines. There was also a comment came from Jay Anderson of Project Unity. He said that someone had told him, he had a contact who said, if you want to have a vision of reality or a vision of the phenomenon, watch the German series Dark. Dark is a 3-season series that involves people moving through time and across timelines. A lot of the notions you find in that series are those you find echoed in the Burish claims, which is all about timelines. What Burish reports is that the Roswell incident involved our descendants traveling to their past in order as part of an effort to secure the genetic material they need to address a peripheral neuropathy, which is causing the degeneration of their people then, and which seems to be leading to their extinction. Simultaneous to their arrival here, there were the arrival of other groups. So what Burish points out is that what you see here, and what we think are aliens and extraterrestrials, are complementary and competing groups of our descendants along different timelines. Mm-hmm. Now, some of these groups wished to avert the catastrophe in their past. One group, they wished for the catastrophe to occur. And what he said, and what Burish claimed, was that the Holloman Treaty, where humanity had that choice between working with the Greys or with the Orions, was a choice between working with those who wanted the catastrophe to occur and those who wished to avert it. Now, what seemed to have happened, in the claims, is that there was an initial agreement to work with those who had wished this to happen, whereas the other groups who didn't want that to happen weren't able to prevent that engagement with government. Now, overall, though, Burish and his team did succeed in working with those groups who did not want to happen, and thereby they succeeded in averting that great catastrophe, which was activated by the Earth crossing a galactic plane and thereby becoming subject to a series of energies which would have been magnified and amplified by the presence of natural stargates and artificial stargates on the planet, leading to some great catastrophe that would have wiped out 95% of humanity. And then the survivors, they themselves would branch off into two groups. One would become the Greys, to use the shorthand. The other would become the Nordics or the Orions on the other hand. Now, we averted that timeline, which was called Timeline 2, and we situated ourselves along Timeline 1. And whereas we avoided that catastrophe that would have killed 95% of us, along Timeline 1 was this famous Variant 83, which is this is a scenario where an attack on Iran would precipitate an Indo-Pakistani war, which would then lead to a Chinese, Russian, American three-way nuclear conflict. So we would end up with a World War III scenario on a devastated planet. Alongside that variant, which Burish and Majestic were trying to prevent through Operation Jericho, is what this disclosure called it, but Burish didn't give a name to it. There were other variants which were equally led to devastation for humanity. If you go back to the old the Eagles Disobey website, there's discussion of those. If you get into the weeds, the various variants, but all involve a small regional conflict spiraling out of control and leading to some sort of devastating exchange.
And we just had a weird conflict between India and Pakistan a couple of weeks ago, and then we've got the strike that happened on Iranian nuclear facilities just over the last 48 hours. Yeah. And it seems like it definitely feels like there's something in the air. But let me ask you this. I mean, another thing that comes up when people talk about Burish is like, why would this guy come forward and just spill the beans on so much detail and then disappear and never answer any more questions? He's just gone. What do you make of that? And what was the reasoning behind why he made the videos that he made and the interviews at the time?
Well, he was given orders to tell the world, so to speak. He was given orders to tell the world, and I think it was supposed to be a 1-year effort, but he continued past that deadline and kept open communication and telling people what he knows. And that his relationship with his kind of very close camaraderie with Vice Admiral John Mike McConnell allowed him to remain alive, even though so many scientists before him since the early 2000s have been mysteriously dead. So, I don't know, what is your take, Martin?
I think, again, the fact that Burish removes himself from the scene is striking because it's contrary to the behavior you see of so many in ufology 2.0. That is, they take up residence in the cultural space, going from one show to the next, one claim to the other. I think Burish came forward. He made his claim. He spoke about what he knew, and he just removed himself because I think he said what he had to say. I think it almost is greater force for that.
Right. But the problem I have is he essentially went to the UFO community. And I think that was if he was truly tasked with telling, quote, the world, why wouldn't he do it the way To the Stars did it? Put together something that is an event and an organization that appeals to the world and doesn't necessarily focus on ufology. I mean, I'm sure there could have been connections with major media sources. So it was very odd to me that
seems like, yeah. Sorry to step on your thought, Brian, but just to your point, it seems very strange to me as well. It's like a group that supposedly has access to limitless resources to do all of these other things. And then when it comes time to actually just tell people information, they're like, well, we're going to send out one guy for 6 months. He's going to do it. And we're going to just have him interview with UFO people. It's like, well, can't you call CNN and can't you put the apparatus in play and tell people what is this?
I don't think they
half in, half out thing.
Okay, so the other side of this that I've been considering is I don't think they wanted the world to know, so they sent Dan out to tell ufology because the call for this to even happen came from the NHI itself as part of a treaty agreement. And I think they just wanted to be able to check that box. Okay, we're telling the world, Dan, go talk to ufology. Talk to them for about a year. Look, NHI, we checked that box. I don't, because it wasn't effective. It went to a very small demographic of enthusiasts within the subject. It certainly didn't get out to CNN. So
I mean, more people are talking about Dan Burish today than probably have ever talked about him ever. And I think that's only because of YouTube. His claims are so perfect for, like, his presentation is YouTube gold. It's just he sits there and he keeps going, and there's more and more detail, and then there's another layer, and then there's another layer, and you're like, when is this guy going to run out of material? And he just doesn't. And at the end of it all, you go, well, that sounds like a person who lived through it. It's like Bob Lazar when he talks. He's just, the tool bench was over there, and there was a clock on it, and there was a light, and it was one of those that had a dial. He can describe the room.
Yeah.
It just seems like, I don't know. I always, whenever I talk about Dan Burish, I just kick off like a bunch of weird, like a firestorm online, and I have a headache at the end of it, and I don't feel like I've learned anything.
Well,
It's a bizarre story.
If I can say two things. First off, I think all credit here has to go to Brian. Brian is the one who was doing overwhelmingly all of this research, and he's the one who's put that website together, collated and created all the material. So credit where it's due. It's Brian. And what he's done is unusual in the field in terms of the quality of the research and the presentation, which I think he's done. I think he's done Burish and his story a great service. I've known Brian because, well, I got talking to him through a different forum because I've always found the story to be extraordinarily compelling for reasons I've outlined. And that's how I got to know Brian. We often chatted about it. I think generally very few people were interested in the story. I think that's fair to say. And I don't think there may be a lot of people who really thought it was that critical or important. In terms of how the story presents to the world, at the end of the day, there are none so blind as those who will not see. I'm not sure what they can do. I mean, as you noted at the very start, Clint, you said people find Burish weird. Like, if people in ufology find Burish weird, what is your average journalist at CNN going to make of him? I mean, this is like, if we're on the edge of the edge.
But it's weird, like Bob Lazar hits the scene and then faces a period of backlash, a period of ridicule, manages to come through it, and then is later vindicated in many ways by revelations that happen decades later. In much the same way, I would expect to see Dan Burish vindicate, and he kind of is. A lot of the things that he talked about have kind of come out in one form or another subsequently. Why is he so elusive? Why not just reappear, or can someone make contact? Has anyone tried to make contact with him? I mean, I think that's the question everybody wants to know the answer to. Where is Dan? Yeah. And what would he say today?
Well, I think I know where he's at, but I don't have his address. That's incidental at this point. The point is that what I'm certain of, and I know Martin knows this, he is not supposed to be contacted. He is surrounded by people who are protecting him, and he's a canary in a gilded cage right now. So if there is going to be any sort of proactive measure by his people, and these people, when I say his people, Martin, you know this, he's surrounded by people. And these are, one of them's a doctor, two of them are security, and then some are just handlers of various types. And that's the last I heard. And the last time they reached out to me was in 2022. So it's a one-way communication. You can't reach out to them.
I know of a person who has a pretty significant following who was trying to get into contact with Dan. And they certainly had the means to do it if they wanted to. It would be a media person who wanted to get in touch with him. And this person told me basically what you just said. It was spooky. They got spooked. They were like, I can't get to this guy. It's weird. There's like some kind of force field around him, and I just can't get to him. And I thought that was the strangest thing. And I asked for more information. I didn't get it. They just got spooked, and they were like, I'm just going to leave this one alone. That's the only thing I have to add to what you just said, but it seems like other people have definitely tried.
And it did not used to be that way. It used to be he had this forum where it was open to the public if you knew the address to the forum, and you could actually see dialogue he had with other people in his group.
This is the golden thread?
Yes, the golden thread. And it was cryptic in nature, codified and cryptic, but there were some elements of posts that he would put out and Marcy would put out where you could offer some perspective. And they valued people who had a very good, honest disposition about their posts back onto the forum. And so there was a two-way communication. And that's how they eventually reached out to me and said, we would like to involve you in something. And it was a very small effort, but it had to do with his Lotus work that he spoke at Caltech about, and getting somebody outside of the sciences to look at the material and see if it's going to make sense, because his whole thing was to get this into peer reviewed and get it out into the scientific community as a gift to humanity. And he wanted to make sure somebody like me, who's not in the sciences, could make sense of it. But the manner in which he did it was mysterious unto itself. I told him in a phone call for an hour and a half in 2018, when he told me about this, I said, Dan, I am not a scientist. I'm interested in what you have to share with me, but you're going to have to tee up what I'm about to look at, because I know you're probably going to be showing me lots of scientific material that's over my head. And he gave me drops in various forms. Sometimes it would be on this golden thread. Sometimes it would be through a proton mail. And sometimes it would be through private messages on the forum between he and I. And none of it was ever teed up for me. And I was just sitting there thinking, what is going on here?
Let me change. Let's change gears just a little bit, because I think this is really fascinating for people. You've talked to Dan Burish on the phone
for an hour
multiple times.
No, just once.
Just once. What is he like?
Very, very nice. Very nice, very warm. He and I are a year apart. We talked about our youth. We had very similar upbringings. He shared some personal stuff about his injury he had when he was a child, that it still is with him today. He shared, a lot of things. But the point and purpose of the call, which became very evident, was he was gauging my trustworthiness. Because at various times throughout the call, like 3 or 4 different times, he goes, you know what, I'm feeling comfortable talking to you. And when I heard that, I felt he's got something planned, and I don't know what it is, but I'm just going to be who I am. I'm going to be very honest with what I know about him. He did not at the time, and I think he still does not care for anybody in ufology. He sees it as a walled garden of enthusiasts who just attack each other and character assassinate. And I, in large part, agree with him. And I think that was his gauge. He said, well, you don't seem like the normal, cut from the same cloth as the crazies out there, so I'm going to deal with you.
And since then, he's been in seclusion, or he's living out of the country, or is he in the United States?
No, he's in Canada.
He's in Canada.
Yeah, he's in Canada. I don't know, Martin, do you want to weigh in on anything that you are aware? Because you were part of that golden thread.
Yeah, if I could just add something to this, this notion of why he did not impose himself on the culture maybe more forcefully via CNN, as you mentioned. I think that, if you were to look back at the time, this is pre-2017, there are not a lot of fora where you could conduct those long-form interviews. There are not a lot of places where they would be hosted. And, Project Camelot and Bill Ryan and Kerry Cassidy was maybe the only port he could pull that ship into. And so the interviews stand there. Now, for any mass media interested in the subject, they would have found Project Camelot quite quickly and quite easily, and they would have found his story. And if they were actually interested in presenting that to the world, they could have done so. There's nothing stopping it. But I think, we have to recognize that the claims are so extraordinary, and they were especially extraordinary then, that I can't see there's any way Burish could have become a publicly known or widely known figure in any way, especially given the fact that he is, as I said, he's quite marked by the experience. What you can see in his later life and later work is that he's quite a humane individual in very obvious ways. Through the Golden Threads and Eagle Disobey, what you see is repeated report of some of their actions in the world, which are very much humanitarian in goal and motivation. And again, those sort of actions speak against some of the control group who will not want to see that sort of transformation in society at large.
I don't know. I think there could have been a framework by which it could have been explained. I think because his story is backed with science, and when you're talking science, that has anchors in reality that we can understand. And so when you talk about the biology of the creature, when you talk about the technologies behind the idea that there could have been time travel and that there could have been these devices and how they built them, it wouldn't be an overnight. It would be a very slow drip. His story could have been told to the world in a very slow drip, very logical and very methodical way that I think could have been managed way different than the way he did it.
It seems to me like what I would love to see today would be put him in a room with Gary Nolan and let these two guys talk about biology for a couple hours. I would just love to be a fly on the wall for a conversation like that. I think that, you know, that's the thing with ufology is weird, and it's got weird people in it, but so does professional football. I mean, anything is weird. It's all weird. At a certain point, at the heart of it, I think everybody does want more or less the same thing. We're just grasping for straws. And so a lot of the weirdness in the UFO world is just because we don't know what we don't know. There's this fan fiction element that sort of, and you know, it's like a whistleblower came out of nowhere. And who's the whistleblower? Well, it's just a person on the internet with a PDF that they're sharing around. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think like a whistleblower is someone, I know your name, I know where you worked, I know what department you were in, you were on record, like we know you're blowing the whistle on this group. It's not just a random person.
But Clint,
and the problem with ufology is anybody can show up. There's no prequel. You just roll in. If you got a good enough story, you know, and a lot of people do.
But Clint, if I could maybe just respectfully just push back a little on these notions of Burisch's extraordinary maybe weirdness or obscurity. In the first instance, let's look to the fact he did lecture at Caltech. He really is an extremely competent scientist in reality, indisputably, in a way that's not linked to his claims. That alone almost distinguishes him in the field. And the second thing is in terms of that obscurity, he is now obscure. But he hasn't always been. There was that time when he was very exposed, and his interviews and those long form interviews still stand. I think there is something to the notion of someone just coming forward, saying what they need to say, and then removing themselves to let it stand.
But I think also in so much of this discussion where we're asking questions why, we have to remind ourselves that the genesis of some of these answers are coming from the relationship of the agreements we probably are still ongoing and having with the entities. Yeah. If we're going to be honest with ourselves, and we're going to especially believe Dan's story, there are ongoing treaties that are revisited every 9 years, and there are agreements, and some of those might be driving geopolitical decisions worldwide. Who knows? Because if we're talking about understanding a future timeline and that we have an ability to monitor it and alter it, the agreements we have with these entities may be driving a lot of these decisions, which we just don't understand right now. I just think that that's a factor that has to be considered, that we have to run through the filter in our mind, that behind the scenes, maybe these things that seem absolutely crazy aren't because it's our choice.
We're not getting the full picture. We're getting bits and pieces of a bigger thing that's
like
going on.
Final scene in A Few Good Men. You know, you need me on that wall. I do things behind the scenes. You get up every day and live your life, but I'm doing stuff behind the scenes that you could never fathom. Mm-hmm. You know, it's that kind of concept where maybe the Mike McConnells out there in the MJ12 group are waking and going to bed every night, crapping their pants, dealing with stuff that they know the rest of the world can't deal with. I don't know. But it would be a logical conclusion that we have relationships. Listen, it's actually almost public record now through David Grush with his testimony to Congress that we have nothing short of agreements. And he was asked twice by Ross Coulthard and did not answer in the negative.
This is what I'm getting at. It's like the stuff Burish was saying 25 years ago is bearing fruit today. And it's so weird. It's like people push back on me, and I'm a Dan fan. But as you said, Martin, earlier, his claims when they were made were novel and extremely procedural, very like and a lot of it's boring detail, which I thought was an interesting data point too. Like he walks through the very detailed steps that he had to go through to just enter the clean sphere. This is what I would expect from someone who worked on a very complicated program with a biological entity. You would expect to hear the protocols explained in detail. You would expect to know like how many feet from the table to the door to the room next door. You know, this kind of stuff is what the richness of his answers in that interview with Hamilton.
And
you almost can't overstate it. I feel like people tend to overlook that, you know.
And there is,
it's not all about the Orion Cube and all of these amazing predictions. It's about like the level of detail. Like they weigh you when you come in. You got to stand on the scale naked. Then you have to go to the thing. You know, that kind of stuff. What do you make of all of that detail? It sounds like the stuff that when Bob Lazar talks about detail like that, people go, "See, it's real." But when Dan talks about it, it's not the same thing.
well, I think there's a general principle that all experience in time becomes banal. And you do find that in some of Burish's report. He's just recounting, for him, which are banal, ordinary facts. For you are either utterly extraordinary. And if our experience with them, initial experience with them, would be reported with great excitement and obvious emotion. You see that in Burish, and that's another aspect of his testimony which recommends it. If I can also just come back to the point regarding the agreements and something Brian said. Brian pointed out, he said that perhaps there is a requirement that you do tell the public, that there is a box to be ticked. And Burish did tell the people. Majestic did speak to the world, if we are to believe Burish and his claims. They've spoken. It's right there on the internet, very easy to find. But there's another aspect of the Burish story which supports this idea that they have to tell the people of what they're doing. And that is the communication you'd find on the Golden Threads and the Eagle Disobey Forum, which seem to be an awful lot of internal communication. And Brian, of course, can speak about this. This is where these team members would be speaking among themselves, seemingly about ongoing operations and activities in different parts of the world. And if you paid close attention to those communications over time, what you would see is that they would often anticipate some great events in the world. So, for example, I remember one where they shared what was seemingly a lot of satellite imagery and imagery from on the ground of the buildup of the People's Liberation Army outside of Hong Kong, which was done to threaten the pro-democracy movement there. Now, I remember seeing this, and this was days before it was reported in the mainstream media. And for me, that was an extremely arresting moment. I remember when I mentioned it, Brian had another story, I think it was about the situation in Nigeria.
Boko Haram. Yeah, Nigeria. That's the way our phone call ended, just to be brief. Dan said, Marcy's telling me I got to go. Is everything okay? We have a flight to catch. We have to get to Boko Haram because another military group took over a bunch of schoolgirls at a school, and we're going to fly out there and try to help them. And as Martin could attest, seemed like so much of his effort was spent on humanitarian aid stuff. There was this significant break from science and J-rods and S4 to then being put in a position where he had to work with foreign leaders and foreign dignitaries and be sent off doing different kinds of humanitarian aid. And to that point, this Boko Haram story didn't break until the day after on the news.
So when you hear somebody like George Knapp say his wife was driving the limousine and I was out back by my house, I know where they were, and he puts on a Desert Storm hat, but he never served, and all he really goes after some of these claims, and you're saying not so fast. There's actually more going on here than meets the eye because of this golden thread thing. Can you explain for people who don't understand, for kids today who grew up on the internet the way we understand it today? What is the golden thread? Where was it? Where would someone find it? How did it work? Take us back.
Okay, and then I'd like Martin's input as well. I found the term golden thread being mentioned in a lot of the research I was finding on Dan from people who have written about him. And I eventually found the golden thread was this like archaic 1990s forum platform, from back in the dial-up days almost. It was void of any aesthetics. It was pure information and utilitarian. And when I looked at it and saw, even before I became like a member, and I saw messages from Dan and messages from Marcy and messages from people calling themselves MJ1 and I'm like, wait, what is this? This is weird. But this looks like Dan is talking about stuff that I knew Dan was involved in. So it was codified. It was militaristic in many ways. It put Dan in a place of authority on this forum for sure. And it was not full of public people. It seemed by the most part, it was operational dialogue between members of a group.
It didn't feel culty or weird to you, and like this, nothing like that.
No, not in what people would probably think in a traditional sense.
Because
You're looking at operations. Like, what is this I'm looking at? And it's codified like QAnon stuff.
Yeah.
like you said, I think a lot of people think, if you get this idea that Dan is a strange guy surrounded by a group of people, that could sound to someone like a cult, and maybe that he's just surrounded by a bunch of followers. You're saying this is not that. This was way more organized, totally different.
What do you think, Martin?
Well, a characteristic of a cult is that it's difficult to find, or it's easy to find but difficult to leave. This is the opposite. This was very difficult to find and very easy to leave, because they kick people off like that. Yeah,
they were booting people left and right who they felt didn't have respectful dispositions on the forum.
So Martin, what's your take on the points that George Knapp makes about how a lot of this traveling around the world James Bond kind of stuff is just fluff, and there's nothing to it. He's just making all that up.
Well, I'd observe about George Knapp is that he's a journalist, and he is, he's earning a living in this subject. And critical to earning a living is that he's got contacts who provide him with stories. I mean, as you noted earlier on, is that you need to keep coming up with fresh material. And what better source for finding material are those on the insiders who are well placed to provide it to you. I mean, that sounds cynical, but they're a statement of facts. Now, whether they wholly apply to George Knapp, I don't know. But to just repeat myself, it seems most improbable that the subject is not being managed. If it is being managed, then there are gatekeepers. Those gatekeepers would include journalists in the field. They have to. These are people, and again, it's not sort of a straightforward mercenary exchange. Here's an envelope and here's the script. Instead, it would be, you can ask about anything, I'll help you about anything, but please understand, Burish needs to be contained. And then what moreover is that you can add to the corruption with this sort of, with a flattery. You bring these people into an inner circle, you share some secrets with them. You say, look, George, okay, we're going to bring you in, we're going to tell you what it is, what's actually happening. And so then you encourage their loyalty to this effort of cultural management and systemic disinformation. Now, I know that sounds almost cynical, or it is cynical, and it sounds almost paranoid. But again, I have to insist, it's what you would expect. It's improbable to expect the opposite, which is a free and open exchange of ideas and active processes of discovery and authentic research, ongoing in ways that you'd find in other fields. So I would say when you see this, rapid shutdown of someone like Burish, this instant dismissal, this public contempt, this speaks to an effort to ensure that his story remains hidden from view. Let's go back to taking pictures of the craft.
Or they just don't care to look into it, and they're very ill-informed. Bottom line, that's not unusual in ufology. Somebody has an opinion about somebody, and when asked, well, did you study the entire story? Oh, I don't need to. That formula of discreditation is common in ufology. It's so easy.
But
you can go by your gut reaction and just hang your hat on that.
Yep.
Not that you did the research, not that you looked into the whole story so we can have a common, decent discussion about it. You just rather be emotional and go, easy. That's the easiest thing to do when studying anything related to the subject, which is already wild. Yeah. Just go with your negative gut reaction.
It's even more interesting because you have, he says Dan Burish is a nothing burger. Don't look at it. Don't worry about it. Don't bother with this guy. Mm-hmm. And this is on the heels of a 3-hour interview with Matthew Brown. Matthew Brown wrote the Immaculate Constellation document that Michael Schellenberger submitted to Congress and is now on the congressional record. And Dan Burish's name is mentioned in the papers that accompany that document, not one time, but multiple times.
Yeah.
And the cover letter was written by Jeremy Corbell. So it's really weird that neither of them seem to know anything about Dan Burish, and yet Michael Schellenberger referenced him. That was just very, very strange.
I am certain they would say, we were never aware of what Michael was going to submit on his own to Congress as follow-up documentation. They were probably only aware that he was given the Immaculate Constellation. So
yeah,
that makes sense. Falling out with him on that. But I don't think they were aware of that.
Yeah. So maybe it's unfair to put them on the spot for that.
For that, yeah. I think Michael was operating a little bit independently in that position, in that hearing, and even to the point where I think Jeremy was not happy with the fact that his cover letter was not put on there and he was not mentioned. I think there was a little bit of falling out there, and this just adds to it.
This just
He
adds.
submitted lots of other documentation they were never aware of.
But Schellenberger would be the one to ask. He's the guy.
I don't think he's that irreproachable. I think he's probably around.
But I mean, it seems like it would be an easy enough question to address, and especially with the renewed interest in it, in the case. Well, let me ask you a different question. Let's leave Dan Burish behind for a minute, and let's go over to Stephen Greer, who seems to be squarely situated on the outside of whatever this disclosure conversation that's happening with this other group. I don't know about what your thoughts are on this, but it seems like Greer he has a separate media ecosystem that he interacts with. He talks to different podcasters. He's just not involved with a lot of the same people. What's going on with him in your view? Do you have an opinion or a thought on that?
Go ahead, Martin.
Well, I notice that mention of Stephen Greer is a sure way to have a post disappear off Reddit. I've had a number of times put forward, just even mention, this is what Greer said here, given Greer's status in the field, what do you think, that sort of thing. These posts just vanish.
Really?
For instance, that recent claim he made that he was told we can anticipate an alien intervention towards the end of 2026, 2027. Maybe those dates wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was towards the end of 2026, at least was mentioned. That notion just completely, those posts just disappear off Reddit. The other post I made where I report Greer's claim, there was an element of the control group who were based in Salt Lake City were set to weaponize some zero-point energy system with a view of opening a portal to a hell realm and unleashing demons and monsters upon a world in order to precipitate Armageddon. Anytime I've tried to post that story, that disappears as well. So I've a bit of experience.
That does sound like a video game, though. That sounds great. That sounds like the plot of Doom.
I'm not saying this is true. I'm just noting Greer has been at the forefront of disclosure for so long. He's brought forward hundreds of first-hand witnesses. So if he says something, if he claims this is supported, we have to listen to it, just reasonably. And I noticed that any time I made any such reports, they'd completely disappear off Reddit. And incidentally, I had someone reach out to me privately explaining why that was, but that's neither here nor there. The other thing with Greer is that even before 2017, he seemed to be targeted by certain groups. So even with Project Camelot, he clashed with Kerry Cassidy in their interview, which you can find online. And also, Project Camelot very weirdly, for a period of time, set about trying to destroy Greer personally. Now, Greer, it would seem, it seems to be gay or bisexual or something. Who cares? But what Project Camelot did was they were posting stuff from his dating profiles, dating some of his nudes. It was completely bizarre, but it was obviously purposed towards a sort of his personal destruction. So, I think what Greer says, he does stand at distance from a certain effort that has been made. Greer has also said that his claim is that he enjoys extraordinary extraterrestrial support for what he does. But there are problems with what Greer himself has claimed about the cover-up insofar as that he's seemingly has radically changed his view without admitting such.
Well, in what way would you say has he changed his view?
Greer, the Disclosure Project, when it started coming forward, I think from about 99, 2000 onwards, it presented to the world first-hand testimony. The people that Greer brought forward all had to provide proof of who they were, and they had to go on the record and had to do so publicly. But alongside that, Greer also wrote an awful lot about the cover-up, about the nature of the cover-up. He also wrote a lot about cosmology, about the structure of the universe, the nature of spirituality, his own experiences, his predictions and prophecies for the future. There's an awful lot of material there in his books, which incidentally, you don't see referenced too much. But there, what he did was he provided, I think, was a very compelling account of the nature of the cover-up. And it was quite simple. He said, the cover-up is purposed to cover up certain sciences and technologies that have been developed as a result of the study of the phenomenon, and including recovery of craft. He said these sciences and technologies, they would revolutionize human civilization, and that they would empower developing countries. It would free them from a need to import oil, coal, and gas, and it would lead to the rapid economic development. That rapid economic development would refashion the world's geopolitical order, meaning that the United States and its allies would no longer dominate. Instead, the United States and its allies, with 10-15% of the world's population, would have 10-15% of the world's power. And what Greer said is that the control group, they're essentially a bunch of modified Nazis, for want of another word. That's how they saw the world, that they were also deeply racist, they were eschatological, and this is why this subject is subject to so much ridicule. It's why it's hidden from view. It's why you have so much secrecy surrounding what has been learned. In later years, though, what you find is that Greer changes his account of this control group. He begins to admit that it involves Russian and Chinese elements. Now, these Russian and Chinese elements are now supposedly supportive of ongoing Western domination, which, if you look at the world at large, seems to be an absurd claim. Instead, Russia and China are in desperate contest with the United States and its allies. Yet, behind the scenes with this subject are working hand in glove, marching in lockstep with the United States and its allies to ensure the secrecy and, of course, help manage disclosure as we find it currently unfolding.
So what are we to make of that? We've heard this from other sources as well, and John Weygandt was one of them that Stephen Greer interviewed, actually, that John Weygandt interview I refer back to, which I'll link to in the show notes for this. But he said the same thing. He said there were Chinese, there were at least Russians, there were multiple nationalities involved in the recovery project for the craft in Peru. I think I think Lazar has said the same thing, right?
Yeah.
Dan Burish has said it. S4. There were Russians. There were a few different international groups. I don't remember who it was specifically, but this is something that's come up again and again, going back a number of years. So, which is it? Are they part of the program, or what is your sense?
Well, I tend to believe Lazar. Lazar speaks about that there were Russians there in the 80s, I think in the 80s and 90s. I find Lazar wholly credible. I do also notice is that neither the China or Russia or any other government at any stage contradicts what the United States and its allies claim for the phenomenon. And I'm just observing the fact that the rationale that Greer claimed for the cover-up seems to not stand as clearly as it once did, if he now admits there is Russian and Chinese support for it.
So where does that put Greer today on the game board, in your view, vis-a-vis the larger conversation going on and the personalities involved in it? Like, where does he relate? How does he relate to everybody else on the game board?
Well, I think what distinguishes Greer from everyone else is Greer has always insisted there's no threat present. Categoric. They're thoroughly benevolent and benign. They may, he has always said, they may take action against certain military groups. They may take action in self-defense, but for humanity as a whole, they have nothing but goodwill.
I'm going to offer something else that's just my observation. It seems like Stephen Greer is a gateway into this subject for very young people. There are so many people I run into, and I ran into some at Contact in the Desert, college age. What do you think of Stephen Greer? That's why we're into this. It's because of Stephen Greer. I'm like, what is he doing to connect with you guys? He seems to be synonymous with a younger group of people, and maybe that's a objective and managed, but it's just fascinating to me how many young people know of Stephen Greer. It's like, I don't follow him much. Where are you seeing stuff I'm not seeing?
Stephen is an interesting character because on the one hand, I have had questions about Stephen Greer and some of the things that he said in the past, and I have mixed feelings for, like everybody. It's complicated. But one thing that I think he's really good at is he is, at the same time, he can be kind of egotistical, but he also has a charisma. He has a charisma. He can rally people. He's got a plan. He's got a vision. He has an optimism about him. He's like, look, this is not all said and done. There is an end point to this, and we can get there. And when you get there, here's what it's going to look like. We've lost a century. He paints a picture, and that picture has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and the end is optimistic.
Yep.
With other people, I've noticed it's either more questions or confusion. There's really no vision. Like Elizondo, it's
it's dark, it's complicated, it's mysterious. I can't really get into it right now, but
And also, Clint, if I can just come into that about Elizondo. If you read Imminent, the case he points to immediately is Corrales, this island off the coast of Brazil. And I had, at this point, I think I have read literally everything. I felt I've read everything. I've been so interested in this subject. I've sought out every book. I've read every magazine. And for the life of me, I don't think I ever came across Corrales. And it's a bit like, again, with what's the first case you talk about? Oh, it's craft menacing an aircraft carrier at sea. Of all the things to talk about, that's the one you pick up on. It couldn't be something, say, we saw a craft land in a national park, and what they seemed to be doing was taking samples of plants. They waved at us and they flew off. That's equally authentic. There'd be many such cases.
That's an excellent point.
It's just, again,
Corrales is a weird one.
And what happens, and what he's talking about, you got poor people in Corrales, this island, they report they're being zapped by these things. They're being attacked. They're being menaced. These Nordics and Greys are running around. What are they doing? Goodness knows. There's no communication. There's no talking. There's nothing benign. There's nothing benevolent. And, as we're speaking about Greer, you know how Greer feels about Elizondo. Right from the get-go.
Yeah.
Right from the get-go, he said, this he's not what he seems.
Well, Corrales is a weird case too, because at the same time you have this extraordinary story, and there's a tremendous amount of evidence and forensic data that they collected and photographs and all of this stuff. But if you just step back from it and look at the net results of whatever this attack or harassment was like a few people got some burns. Was anyone seriously injured, and did anyone actually die? I don't remember if anyone was actually killed.
I think there were serious injuries, though. I do think.
Yeah.
There was.
You know what? I stand corrected, but I do think, at least in my memory of reading the chapters, you would read it. If you were new to the subject, you'd feel some alarm. You would think this is not rainbows and ponies. This is not something welcome. And then you implicitly would think, okay, there's probably good reasons for secrecy. There's probably good reasons for military and intelligence management of this subject. There's probably good reasons to give them further power. That's kind of the read of it. And I'm just making the point is that if you looked at ufology as a whole, of all the evidence that was seemingly there on the table, like, why pick up on that? Like, if you're, let's put it this way, you could equally, with equal validity, you could say report on what the contactees in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s were saying. That's equally valid. There are any number of people who have come forward with claims there. And there you find accounts that would support some of the ideas that Greer tries to push. Yeah, they are benevolent. They are older, more advanced civilizations, and they're trying to help us at this juncture.
I mean, God, that really would be the ultimate threat to everything it would change everything overnight.
And
if they were actually space brothers, if they were like, look, we made it farther than you, but we could help you. You just have to listen. And then people would go, oh my God. Okay, well.
Well, and also, here's a thought. Maybe there is something to the ethics of intervention, which is that up until now, there has been, maybe there's an ethic where civilizations have to stand off, that they can't intervene. You have to let natural processes unfold. But maybe you reach a point where that civilization is on the verge of collapse. And now you can intervene quite forcefully, or rather you can, and what I mean by force is not physical force, but cultural force, intellectual force, spiritual force. So in other words, in a dying world, if a group were to come to you and say, how would we rebuild? What would a new civilization look like? Can you help us? There, the ethics allows for extensive intervention in a way that previously the ethics would have demanded to stay back. Again, imagine a small isolated island with native peoples there. The consensus could be is to leave those people alone. You preserve their freedom. But if the island was burning down, well, then yeah, you could intervene. If you could see that there were people there desperately trying to figure out how to rig up a sailboat or something, well, yeah, you could intervene and say, here, take this, go. At that point, there's no.
It's a great analogy, by the way.
Yeah, you don't have.
That's a great point.
You don't have to worry about saving the culture. There's no ethical dilemma there. You haven't breached any law. It's just that everything's been lost. You can step right in, and so that's what I think maybe is what we face now, and I think that's maybe why the control. When I mentioned it, like UFO when I describe ufology 2.0 as a ghetto, it's larger than the ufology, the ghetto of ufology 1.0, but it's more uniform. Everyone talks about the same things. Everyone's marching in lockstep. And Clint, when we spoke last time, I noticed this happening about a sport in England, about one of the European Championships of the World Cup. I noticed that the whole commentariat, all across the media, were just working in lockstep. They were saying the same things, even though objectively it was quite diluted. And that objectivity you could discover just by looking at statistics, rankings, odds provided by betting companies. So in the same way, I think with the internet, with the fact that so much of how this culture functions is via screens, via electronic means, which can be managed, you do have this impression of something which is moving like a herd or a shoal of fish. It just seems to move here, moves there. Again, 2027
and it isn't actually getting us anywhere. We're just kind of staying.
We're being retarded and misdirected. And I mean, when I say retarded, I don't mean that in the pejorative sense. I mean, things are being slowed down. In other words, the investigation doesn't move with the speed and the directionality you would anticipate. So, for instance, just again, people are drawing up schema of what these craft are like. I mean, that effort, one hand should almost invite ridicule. It's like somebody would say, like, how many times do we have to do this? How many times?
Didn't the Air Force do this 40 years ago? Yeah.
Like you can find these files. You can find, okay, we got this list of craft. This is what they look like. We have to move quickly onto what is the science and technology, release it, but moreover, we have to start communicating with these groups. Because again, to come back to the analogy, the island is actually in a lot of trouble. The fires have taken hold. And if something doesn't change, we are in a lot of trouble.
Let me ask you this as we wrap up. Going forward from this point, we're recording this now. It's middle of 2025, and things are looking pretty rough from a global health standpoint. I mean, it just seems like we're in dire straits. What do you look at the next 5-10 years? What do you see? What do you expect? What would you like to see happen going forward? And this goes to both of you.
Well, I'd like that the subject could get more traction, and that a byproduct of this getting more traction with the general public, especially, that the conversation around it opens up a broader sense of our own identity and who we are right now in this world. I think it's inevitable that when we're confronting the possibility of a future species visiting us and everything that means, and the reality of that starts to sink in, a byproduct of that just seems naturally that the borders and skin colors between us that divide us will probably seem less critical. That's what I hope. It'll be very small increments, but boy, we need it now more than ever. Just the conversation. Maybe they don't land, but let's just listen to the whistleblowers. Listen to the testimony. Let's open our mind to the possibility this could be happening, and just take that to heart.
And I'd echo that call for diversity. I'd like to see a much, much more diverse ufology. I'd like to see that its relationship to the phenomenon takes many more forms than we now see, that it's not so passive, it becomes more active, particularly active in relationship with these non-human intelligence, whatever form they would take. And I hope that relationship sparks some rapid evolution. Again, what we find, particularly fascinating with the report of human extraterrestrials is that beings seemingly built on the same genetic lines as we are far more advanced in every direction we'd want. They're more advanced ethically, they're more advanced spiritually, they're more advanced technologically. So it may be possible for humanity to, or at least some of us, enjoy a very, very rapid evolution, and a sort of evolution which is obvious. It leads to a change in how people see themselves, how they relate to each other, and how they live. So that would be what I'd hope for. And if I could just, again, reference what we mentioned about the Club of Rome and the breakdown of systems. One of the virtues of a breakdown in any system is it allows for competing structures. If you see in our societies right now across the developed world, people are reaching for conventional political solutions. That remains the hope. But it may be possible that those solutions widely fail in what they're trying to do. In that context, there can be a very widespread hunger for very radical change, and people may find that radical change in relationship with the phenomenon, which is becoming more widely known.
Gentlemen, this has been a fascinating conversation. I have got to wrap it there. That's all the time I have. But is there anything else you want to add before we wrap it up? Any place that you'd like to direct people's attention?
Can't think of any.
No, we're good. Thank you. This is fun.
Just the Burish archive.
Yeah, there's
Burish.
That's right.
it's always being added to and edited. So visit it often. I'm still adding to it, and I just got, even as I was sitting here, getting a note from somebody saying you should add this to it. So yeah, there's a lot of material that will be going up on that.
Outstanding.